Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm your host, Anastasia.
I'm Michael Shiloh.
And today with us, we have Patrick Moore, the former president of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace Canada, who spent more than a decade in a leadership position at Greenpeace before leaving the organization because of what he viewed as being their overly doomsday predictions about the future of the world.
And moreover, the monetary capture of that passion to do something right. And I think that that's a really central story in Western society right now, is that people do, by and large, want to feel like they're contributing to making the world a better place. But unfortunately, it seems like that can often lead to complete disaster at the same time. And so today's conversation is really a conversation about the royal scam. It's really about how our own regulatory processes are being used against us, potentially, at least as Patrick Moore presents it, and what we can do about it. And so we really want to get feedback from you guys after you listen to this conversation, because the solution set is still slightly out of reach. And we want to find a way to get into changes that are actually going to make this world better for people, not in the next generation, but 1,000 years from now.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good story of exploring the things that have gone wrong and the ways that people have become preoccupied with markers that might not be the best way of examining the world, but something that we didn't really come to over the course of almost 3 hours is a good answer of what to do next. And rather than wallow in a sense of hopelessness, we really want Demystify Sci to be a place where we come up with ways that the world actually can get better, taking into account all of the ways in which movements have gone wrong in the past. And we need your help to do that. So tell us in the comments, tell us on Discord, join our Patreon at patreon.com/demystifysci, where you can come to our weekly patron chats where we can start thinking about these things. And as we start to get more and more donations, we're going to start funding projects that help us move in the direction of actually doing stuff in the world and not just sitting in armchairs and talking about it.
Because from where we're standing, one of the only things that we can do that would really help make this a better landscape is funding independent science institutions, because all of the present authority structures in science are pegged to the same monetary reward structures. And the only thing we can think of is to make structures beside those existing structures that are capable of analyzing the landscape from a different set of objectives. Anyways, that's going to happen. So get on board, help us out. Even if you can only give a couple bucks, it's really going to add up sooner or later. And we will be on the edge of that. And we're not the only ones. There's other podcasts that are doing the same thing. So let's make it happen. And for now, enjoy the conversation, and please let us know what you think.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I'm mostly tired of stories. Those are for bedtime for kids, and I don't understand the narrative, the consensus. It's really boring. There's no substance to those kind of words, and if it's just political, I'm not interested, because there's no way the climate is political. Yet they have made it so. In a very powerful way. I mean, we are climate deniers if we question a single word of their gospel. And it is really like gospel because it doesn't really have any grounding in reality. The fact that CO2 was 10,000 parts per million when modern life emerged in the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago or so, it didn't seem to stop life from exploding. And 10,000 ppm, I mean, that's so much higher, more than 20 times higher than it is now. And there's a wonderful myth, and that the Royal Society of Horticulture even buys into it, that if you talk to your plants, they will grow better. And they, in their article about it, they seem to think that it's the talking that is making them grow better, when in fact it's the 50,000 ppm of CO2 that you are breathing on them when you're talking to them. That's why they grow better. And so all you have to do is sit there and breathe on them. You don't, they don't have a brain, I mean, to interpret your talking. And that is not what's making them grow better. So, but people
Wouldn't it be nice
believe-
though if it was true? It's a happy thought, anyways.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of happy thoughts. Happy thoughts like no fossil fuels will ever be used again. You know, that for some people, that's a happy thought. And for some people, it's a happy thought that we will stop using artificial, as they like to call anything humans make, fertilizer. And why you would describe things that humans make as artificial, it's as if we are artificial then. Like we're not a robot. And the things we make are made by life. In the same way that I guess a nest is built by a bird. You know, is that artificial because the bird built the nest? No, it's not. It's perfectly natural. And everything we are doing is perfectly natural. And there's where you come up to the word unnatural. And there actually isn't anything that is really actually unnatural. Otherwise, it wouldn't be here. And unless you want to put value judgments on things that humans do, I'm sure eating is not unnatural. And
well, I think that's actually a really interesting point, one that we talk about a lot, which is that the value judgments are kind of what make humans. The fact that we have moral systems where we look out and we say, this is good, this is bad, this is evil, this is what's the antithesis of
Good?
evil?
I don't know.
It's weird that we have bad and evil, but only good. But this idea that people look at
Noble?
what humans noble, I like that. What
fantastic might be better than good.
there you go. I think that we are uniquely in the position of being able to abstractly consider the impact of our actions. And the bird doesn't think about the nest. The bird doesn't think about, hey, when 100,000 of us gather here and we crap everywhere, it degrades the environment. The bird comes, nests, leaves, and that's just the arc of life. Humans are the only ones that sit around and they're like, hey, it's really dirty here and I don't really like that.
Yeah, that brings me to the point of litter versus pollution. A lot of people think that plastic is pollution. And pollution is a word that describes something that's toxic, that harms some other form of life. Whereas litter is like driftwood on the beach and beer cans by the side of the road. And there's nothing toxic about that. It's amazing. And plastic is one of my favorite subjects because there are so many misconceptions about it, beginning with the great Pacific garbage patch, which doesn't exist. And
Oh no.
this fits in well with my overarching hypothesis, which is that most of the scare stories and doom and gloom scenarios are based on things that are either invisible, like CO2 and radiation, and whatever the bad thing in GMOs is supposed to be. It doesn't have a name, so therefore I don't believe it actually exists, or they would tell us what its name is, or give it a name. GMOs, Monsanto, is all you get, really, when you get right down to it. There is no evidence that there's actually anything in GMOs that is harmful, whereas CO2 is a real thing. And they're trying to tell us that it's going to end life on Earth if we don't stop putting it into the atmosphere, where it has been so much higher in the past when life flourished and the Earth was much warmer than it is now. And so that part of it is ridiculous. And then there are things that are very remote, and that is why polar bears and coral reefs are the icons, because no one can go to the Arctic hardly and count the polar bears, and the people who do are making huge grant applications to keep doing it and still scaring everybody into thinking the polar bears are in danger, when in fact they have multiplied by 4 or 5 times since the treaty was signed among all polar nations in 1973, which nobody, even Coca-Cola, doesn't tell you about that. And it's a true treaty that they have followed all these years. And as a result, the polar bear population has grown by 3 to 5 times its population that it was in 73 due to overhunting. It had got so that rich hunters could go up there and get in a plane and hire an Inuit guide and go out and get some rugs for their living room. And that's what the danger was. That's what the threat was overhunting, not global warming. And but the most amazing thing about polar bears is that they wouldn't exist if it wasn't for climate change. Climate change is what brought them into being. Because during the 200 and some odd million year period before this Pleistocene ice age, which really came into its own in about 2.6 million years ago. Of course, it's arbitrary. It was just going down slowly. But they said, okay, here's where we say it started, when all these glacial maximums came for 40,000 year intervals, and now for the last million years, 100,000 year intervals. The reason it changed in its frequency is called the Pleistocene conundrum, because no one knows. And just make a point of this fact is that there's more that no one knows than there is what they do know about these long-term cycles and the history of life. But it's amazing how much we do know from fossil records and sediment cores and ice cores and all that. Just amazing how much we do know. But
it's kind of incredible that when most people think of the Ice Age, they actually think of just the most recent glaciation.
Yes.
Because obviously that's the one we have the most information about, and that's the one where 90% of the research is focused on. But these things have been happening over and over and over until they weren't. At some point in the deep past, there was just no glaciation at all.
Well, hold on. I want to, before we get into the question of glaciation or not, and the sort of these shifts and new species coming into being as the climate changes, I want to address something that you said, which is that there's not a clear danger from plastic because it's litter rather than pollution.
Oh yeah, let's go back to plastic. And I got into polar bears because it's one of my favorite stories, and I'll maybe continue it later, because I really do. I can show you how polar bears would not exist if it wasn't for climate change. But on the side,
what I want to say is that like the degradation of them into the environment and their breakdown products are, I think, what people worry about. I mean, there's the macroplastics, which is you cut open a whale and it's full of trash.
Those are phony stories. You've never seen a picture of that.
I have.
No, a whale with plastic in its stomach. That they made a fake one in the Philippines.
Is that? Hold on. They made one out of plastic in the Philippines, but I know that
then shoveled plastic into its mouth and took a picture of it. There's pictures of sperm whales on the beach, but there's no evidence that they have any plastic in them because you can't see inside their stomachs.
I think what Anastasia is saying is just the hormone mimetics, those sorts of plastics are what people are terrified of mostly.
On one hand, they say it takes 2,000 years for plastics to break down. On the other hand, they say it's microplastic. Then it must have broken down because nobody's making microplastic. And the reason they come down to microplastic is because it's invisible. In Canada, our fisheries people have gone out to look for the microplastics with nets and filters, taking water column samples. The scientist who did that initially thought he must be doing something wrong because he didn't catch any microplastics.
So there's just a theoretical deduction that they
yes, and then they say it's in our blood, like as if our digestive system can't determine whether something is good to put in your blood or not. If you eat very fine sand, your body won't take it in through the colon into your blood system.
So this is interesting because I know that there's a lab in Canada run by Max Laboron that is finding plastics in the water column and is... I mean, they have data. They publish. There
are plastics in the water column. There's no doubt about that. But it's not like a sea of microplastic like they're trying to make out. And just starting with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, it is fake. They say it's twice the size of Texas and growing rapidly. When in fact, if you take a satellite photo like Germany has for the last many years, and put a composite showing the entire Pacific Ocean, there is no evidence of anything, even though you can see all the Hawaiian Islands quite clearly, and they are not twice the size of Texas. So the other thing is that there's this inference that when plastic goes into the ocean, it becomes toxic. Oh, right. That's why we wrap all our food in it. That's why we put our food in plastic containers. My tzatziki, my pickles, the cabbage and lettuce and everything else gets put in plastic to prevent it from being contaminated. That's why the plastic is being used.
The plastic is being used that way, but it's like the rationale for why plastic is dangerous is because what it's doing is it's leaching it's leaching compounds that look like endocrine molecules into the food.
Have you seen any of these endocrine molecules yourself, Anastasia?
Well, hold on a second. In terms of
have
what
you
running
actually observed evidence of these endocrine molecules? There aren't any. There was a
really fascinating study that I wanted to see a follow-up for, but I didn't manage to find it, which was that there was an Egyptian researcher who was looking at the effects of polyester on reproductive systems, and he was experimenting on dogs, so it's not humans, but he found that when he put dogs into these polyester underpants, their sperm count went down to 0 after 3 weeks of wearing. And it wasn't a temperature thing.
That's fake. He's phony. That's not true.
Well, of course the idea that it's entirely possible for it to be true
what was
cannot
the
be
underpants made out of?
Polyester.
Polyester. You know what ester is? It's not estrogen.
No,
polyester is a
of course, I understand that.
It's a hydrocarbon.
It's a hybrid, and so hydrocarbons are made out of the same molecules or similar molecules than the compounds that are made by the body to cross the lipid bilayer of cells. And these are also, if you have ringed compounds that are breaking off on minute levels and getting into the skin and getting into the absorbent reproductive tissue, and then getting into the cells and changing the DNA expression inside of those cells, it's entirely plausible that there's a mechanism by which plastics are causing harm because they are shown.
You just made up all that.
I didn't make that up. That's literally how hormones work. That's how hormones work. They get across.
Yes, but plastic doesn't have hormones in it.
No, it has hormone mimicking compounds.
No, it doesn't.
What do you mean it doesn't?
What hormone mimicking compounds?
For example, bisphenol A is an estrogen mimic.
Yes, and phthalates were also targeted for this kind of propaganda. But the fact is, the EPA has definitely and finally ruled that they are not a problem. They are not listed. And that's because they're not found to be a problem. And like everything is a problem now. And CO2 is the big one because it's invisible. And the fact that it's the most essential ingredient for all life on Earth, and the fact that it's been so much higher in the past, the fact that the 3 previous interglacial periods before this one, the Holocene, were warmer than it is now, and the CO2 was lower than it is now. None of the evidence points to CO2 being the responsible factor for the slate warming that has occurred since 1700.
Well, hold on. Hold on a second. Let's not get away from plastic. Like, I'm looking up this paper right now where they gave BPA again to rats, and they showed a massive decrease in sperm counts.
Don't believe everything you read, Anastasia.
Hold on. But there's a ton of research that this isn't one paper. There's hundreds of papers that show this.
No, there aren't hundreds. These are mostly outliers. The EPA is so rigid in their positions that if they find anything to make a regulation for, they'll do it. But they have not found that for either you got me saying estrogen. They're not estrogen.
But I'm not saying that they are estrogen. You
use the word estrogen a lot there.
Well, because I'm saying that there is a system that responds to estrogen, and if you have something that looks like the estrogen molecule that is a degradation byproduct of the plastic that you're using for your food or the plastic that you're using for your clothes.
No, there's no such degradation byproduct from plastics. Plastics are non-toxic, and that is all there is to it. They are actually extremely inert. They are very difficult to make
I
reactions with.
don't think that's true because, for example, like I know for a fact that I have plastic containers that if I put something oily into them, you can't ever really get them clean again. And that's a degradation of the plastic.
No, you
because
can
if you
get them clean with a solvent, no problem. It just takes something that will
with
dissolve oil.
soap, like right,
Yes, with soap.
I'll
You
use
can get them
soap
clean
and
with soap.
this look. If you have you have a glass and you put oil in it, and you have a plastic container and you put oil in it, and then you dump the oil out of both containers and you put the same amount of detergent into both containers. The detergent that you need to use for the plastic is much, much higher in concentration than you need to use for the glass in order to get the same amount of oil out. And what that's telling me from just first
Is
principles...
that oil sticks to plastic better than it does to glass.
Exactly. And as it sticks, because it's a hydrocarbon product, why is it not possible for it to be leaching something from the plastic into the oil? Like, why is that?
Nothing in the plastic to leach into the oil.
Well,
That's why.
Why do you say that? So what is BPA?
Bisphenol A.
So it's really, I'm looking at the EPA website.
They tried for years to...
Well, the EPA website says that BPA is a reproductive, developmental, and systemic toxicant in animal studies and is weakly estrogenic. So the EPA clearly thinks that BPA is a problem. They might not have regulated it yet.
They would regulate it if they thought it was a problem.
Well, hold on a second. There's a huge lobby. Like, the plastics industry is a massive, powerful lobby that is used everywhere, and it's in their best interest to not allow that to be regulated.
The anti-plastic industry and the anti-fossil fuel industry has twice as much money as the entire fossil fuel and plastics industry puts into its efforts. That is a fact. It's been documented well. So there's basically...
When did that happen? Why did that happen?
It happened because there's good money in it. And you've got Elon Musk now saying that we're going to use hydrogen to make all our electricity, or 90% of it. 90% of when the wind and sun isn't working. And this is absolutely theoretically and practically impossible. They call it green hydrogen because it isn't being produced from methane. I mean, the irony is that natural gas is CH4. So natural gas has actually got more hydrogen atoms in it than carbon atoms in it. But they don't like that carbon atom there. They want to get rid of that carbon atom. So in order to get green hydrogen, it will cost approximately 20 times more for the hydrogen than it would for natural gas. In addition, hydrogen is an extremely difficult material to handle.
And that's just a profit motivation, is what you're trying to say? That you're creating a market, essentially?
Precisely. He's looking for more government money. And he will continue to do that despite his innate knowledge of these things. He knows that hydrogen will never be the backbone of our electricity system. Natural gas will be the backbone of it because they're switching away from coal, which they say is dirty. And so dirt is dirty. So why is dirty being applied to oil and gas and coal?
Well, because there's lots of byproducts from the burning of those that are molecules that get into the environment that cause various reproductive and health toxicities.
No, that's not true.
What do you mean that's not true?
The pollution control on electric generation plants is extremely good, especially natural gas. There are no byproducts other than water and CO2 because natural gas is cleaned in a factory before it is burnt in a combustion chamber, whereas coal is a different matter, and so is oil, although they can take the sulfur out of oil.
But there's a process by which these things get cleaned, so it's a chain of events that's happening from the moment that you get it out of the ground to the moment that you burn it, and all along the way there are refineries and there are factories that are processing the raw material, and that's a dirty process.
What's dirty about it?
Well, what's dirty is that it is, for example, do you know about Cancer Alley in Louisiana?
Yeah, I've heard the term. It's basically a propaganda term.
Well, it's not a propaganda term because, for example, so in Louisiana, there's this area where there's a tremendous number of refineries and chemical processing plants, and people live next to these plants. And what happened multiple times, and is actually happening, I think, in Texas right now, is that in the southeastern United States, there's these salt domes that are under the ground. And these companies that need to get rid of their garbage, basically, will drill down into the salt domes and will inject massive quantities of carcinogenic chemicals into them. And
I don't know
periodically,
where you get your fairy tales, Anastasia.
well, this isn't a fairy tale. This is
yeah,
well
it is.
documented.
You're not. You show it to me.
Well, there's a there's a book called Strangers in Their Own Land.
Yeah,
where,
but I only go by what evidence I have.
But there was a lawsuit against the
Yes,
company.
there's lawsuits all over the place.
But hold on, this salt dome thing actually
Lawsuits
happened.
don't prove anything when it comes to this kind of
hold on. There's a sinkhole in Louisiana that opened because a wall of this salt dome collapsed and released massive quantities of carcinogenic chemicals into the bayou, as the bayou basically sunk into the hole in the salt dome. This is well documented
in the news?
This was reported in the news. There were scientific papers about it. There were lawsuits where the companies admitted liability.
How long ago was this?
This was probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And now it's happening right now again in Texas, where there has just been...
Heard of it.
I can send you the links for it. There was there's a massive sinkhole that's opening right now in Texas where it's the exact same story. There's a salt dome where a containment wall has been breached, and the bayou that the salt dome is underneath is now being sucked down into it. People's homes are going into it, and it's the result.
Do you have some video of people's homes going into this place?
Yeah, this is all over the news right now. Like this is
today.
Yeah, like in the last week.
I read every news outlet in the world practically every day, and I have not got homes being sucked into a salt dome anywhere.
Hold on one second.
You'd think it might be reported in the mainstream news if that was happening.
There's literally a photograph in the Star Telegram of a home.
The environmental movement ignored the train wreck, basically.
That's not what I saw.
Actually a real disaster.
But that's not what I saw. I saw tons of people reporting on the train disaster.
They were reporting on it, but the environmental movement wasn't doing anything, and neither did Joe Biden even show up till about 40 days later.
That's a whole nother question. Okay, look, USA Today. In the small town of Dissident, Texas, residents this week learned that their massive sinkhole they thought had been stable for more than a decade was expanding. Industrial tanks have been collapsing into the sinkhole this week. Footage shows cracks forming in the ground along the edges of an enormous hole in the ground filled with dark water and other debris.
Including houses?
Including houses, yeah.
You'd think it would mention them.
I'm really curious if you could back this up for me, how you went from being one of the, I don't know how you want to define yourself, but one of the early members.
One of the leaders of Greenpeace for 15 years.
Yeah, I want to know.
And on all the campaigns, which I'm still very proud of what we did. We stopped nuclear testing in Alaska. We stopped atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. We stopped the slaughter of 30,000 whales. I was on all 4 of those voyages. I was leading of 2 of them. I was the navigator. I was the first mate on one. So I ran a Zodiac in front of the harpoons.
Yeah. So how did you go from doing that to realizing this extreme skepticism about the politicization of science and all of that?
Greenpeace got hijacked by the left, period. That's what happened. They realized how much fame and fortune there was in the movement, and they were much smarter at politics than those of us who were basically activists. I'm a scientist. I'm not a political activist. I vowed early on in my life not to ever run for political office because it destroys your life.
And so there wasn't much politics at Greenpeace in the early days?
Internally, yes, but we were not political in any way. And an NGO shouldn't be political. But it's all gone over that way now. And there's nothing I can do about it. And I briefly try to explain that in the beginning, we actually had a strong humanitarian orientation. We were trying to save civilization from nuclear war and the environment from the effects of nuclear war. That's why it was called Greenpeace. Let's let it be a Greenpeace. And that's how how the name started. And gradually, as we went along, humans came to be criticized as the enemies of the earth by many of these movements, including my own. And at a philosophical level, I just find that ridiculous. It's like we're the only evil species on the planet. It's like, like you're born evil. What do they call that? There's a name for it. But,
well, it's a huge weight on the kids who are growing up these days, just to view people. I don't think people have ever seen themselves like that until this modern era.
Oh, I don't know if that's true. They were burning witches and throwing virgins into volcanoes a long time ago.
But not all humans, right?
It's not
funny mankind in general.
It was generally women, the weakest of the sexes, that were being assassinated, basically. So we've had this doom and gloom thing for a long time. But so I didn't like that, but I argued with them about it, that we were not the only species with original sin, or whatever that's the phrase I was looking for. And then my fellow directors, I was one of 6 international directors since we created Greenpeace International, which I negotiated with the other half of the organization when we got into a legal problem. And so we created Greenpeace International, and my fellow directors ended up, none of whom had any formal science education. They were either political activists, social activists. Now you could make a living in the environmental movement, so they just had a job. But it was mostly people gradually coming in from the left politically. And they decided that we should ban chlorine worldwide as a policy for Greenpeace.
Why did they decide that?
Because chlorine is highly toxic. And elemental chlorine is highly toxic. But sodium chloride is an essential nutrient. And
well, sodium is.
Yeah, chloride too.
No, sodium chloride is an essential nutrient. Most people think that when you put 2 molecules together that they stay like they were. They don't. When you put a chlorine with a sodium, it becomes a completely different thing than either one of them. And salt is toxic. If you eat a cup of it, you will die. But toxicology, when we got into this,
I think that's how most Americans are actually dying right now. As a matter of
slowly
fact.
in slow motion.
When we got into toxicology, everything fell apart because none of them had any understanding of chemistry, never mind biochemistry, never mind toxicity and that sort of thing. And that in the same way that do no harm is the medical profession's primary principle, the poison is in the dose is the toxicologist's primary principle. Because a small amount of, there's nothing that a tiny amount of will kill you. I mean, really tiny. You can get. There are some things that are awfully poisonous.
I would say that I would say that the best way to formulate that is that all chemicals have a lower bound for their dose. Like some things, very, very small amounts of will kill you, like, I don't know, polonium or something. But even with polonium, if you go down far enough on the concentration curve, it won't kill you. And in fact, there's a concept for this in biochemistry called hormesis, which is that
hormesis well, yes.
So if you take something that's bad in large, like for example, I studied antibiotics for my PhD, and one of the most surprising things was that antibiotics in large quantities are lethal for bacteria, but in small quantities they appear to be functional signaling molecules that they use to communicate between not just themselves but other species as well.
Yeah, it is really about that. But the key thing to understand about toxicity, other than the poison is in the dose, which is a general principle, but the key thing is to understand that our bodies have a cellular repair mechanism. And the reason certain things that are toxic are only toxic after a certain threshold is because if your body is repairing itself faster than it's being damaged, you are not being damaged. And that our body is dealing with different things every day. Something in your food that your body doesn't want that much of will try to heal itself or not get that in the first place. So we have all kinds of mechanisms to avoid being poisoned But at a certain point, there's no getting around it. And radiation, along with chemicals, radiation is the same kind of formula. So hormesis is the theory that small doses of radiation are helpful because they challenge your body's cellular repair mechanism and make it stronger. And so you can actually, there's people who go underground into abandoned uranium mines and sleep overnight in order to get a higher dose of radiation than you get in your house or on the street. And it's true that when you go up in an airplane, you get quite a bit more radiation than you get when you're at sea level. And there are hot springs in Thailand where people go to swim where it's quite radioactive.
There's also radon therapy clinics in the Rockies. I don't know if you've seen these or not.
What do you make of the reports that those populations suffer greater incidence of cancers? There was an interesting one from the U.S. military about the Air Force pilots and actually the ground crew. I think they were trying to blame it on radiation and also on jet fuel exhaust or something like that.
I'd be surprised if that's a fact. I don't think you get enough radiation in an airplane, even if you're a pilot.
The incidence is a fact. I don't know that the cause is clear to anybody, really. There's definitely a greater incidence of certain cancers, but not the ones you would expect, which is quite strange.
But if it's the ground crew as
also
well.
Also the pilots, yeah.
But if it's the ground crew and pilots together that have the same increase, you would think that it was something to do with the airplanes on the ground.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in the air, because ground crew's not going up.
Yeah.
Ground
they're standing around on the runway.
Airplanes. They hardly ever go in the airplanes, the ground crews. They have a completely different environment.
But they're dealing with the fuel, they're dealing with the de-icing chemicals, with the anti-flammable chemicals.
They're also just standing out in the sun all day.
That's true. But so it's like, I think that this is something that you're saying, which is that if the body's repair mechanisms outpace the level of damage, then you won't get sick. I totally agree with you on that. I think that that's really accurate. And I think the only question is, how much damage are you getting, right? Because if you're working constantly surrounded by chemicals that are damaging you, then you're going to have a harder time not getting sick.
And you're eating bad, and you're not getting enough sleep, and you're stressed out, and your life
drinking
sucks,
a lot, like whatever.
Except for the fact that our longevity has radically increased due to the
longevity in the United States has been crashing for the last 5 years and is now the top 5% of the United States has a lower life expectancy than the bottom 5% of Britain's.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine fentanyl had anything to do with that or other.
I mean, it does. There's a lot of poisoning deaths, but there's other things.
Yeah, it's a lot of young people actually. It's really sad.
Yeah,
it is probably attributable to suicides and
there's also a lot of
overdoses.
Obesity in people these days, and I call them the American waddler.
Well, the levels of obesity are really interesting to me too, because I feel like there is something in the food supply that goes beyond just calories in, calories out. Like,
I mean, just soda alone could do it.
I don't know. I mean,
have you looked at the caloric content of these things?
I guess what I want to make sure
that's why I do SodaStream diet drink. SodaStream is a really good product. You don't use a million cans and wherever the heck they go, and you have to deal with them. So you have 4 or 5 bottles and a SodaStream dispenser and a carbon dioxide canister. Oh my God, there's carbon dioxide in the water. They make it fizzy, and you take a concentrated juice, and they've got diet root beer, diet Coca-Cola, diet ginger ale, diet lime, diet lemon lime, all kinds of great diet pink grapefruit, and there's no calories in it, but it tastes just as good as something with sugar in it.
Interesting. Yeah, we like bubbly water a lot. Maybe we can make a little partner deal.
I mean, I guess
some free bubbly water.
Can I go back to plastic for a minute? Because I want to explain to you 2 of the positive attributes of plastic in the ocean.
Okay, positive attributes of plastic. Let's hear it.
All right, let's do it.
They are no different than driftwood when it comes to being a substrate for hundreds of species, either growing on them or eating the things that are growing on them or having their babies on them and whatever, pieces of plastic. The marine creatures treat plastic no differently than driftwood. On the other hand, plastic has some shapes that are not possible with driftwood, like a cup and a bottle. So that can become a habitat on the bottom. So when I go into the ocean and have a glass container or a plastic container, I sink it to the bottom of the ocean in 500 feet of water or something, where it's going to have absolutely no negative impact, but can become a home for some creature. The other thing about plastic is that marine birds, of which there are millions, including one of the largest birds in the world, the albatross, not quite as big as the condor of the Andes, but a huge bird.
I think 11-foot wingspan.
Yeah, and then there are tons of other marine birds, and all those marine birds use bits of plastic as a substitute for bits of wood and bits of pumice, which is their two favorite other things, and nuts that fall off trees into the ocean. Because there's no pebbles in the ocean, and all birds require pebbles from birth or a reasonable facsimile in order to digest the food in their gizzard, which is a grinding stomach, unlike ours. They also have one like ours, they have two stomachs. But because they have no teeth, birds can't chew their food before they swallow it. And so when an albatross gives its chick a whole squid, say 8 inches long, it goes into the gizzard, where it is ground up by the hard objects that have been given to the chick, because when the chick's in the nest, it can't collect them for itself. So the parents have to bring it. And I have a photograph showing a mother albatross giving a mouthful or a beakful of small, nicely rounded plastic objects of different colors with nothing else in their beak but the plastic bits. That's all it had. It didn't have food there with it. So they're not feeding plastic to their chicks. They're giving plastic to their chicks as a digestive aid. And this is all throughout the bird world in the ocean. It's been studied for 50 years. At first, scientists thought this might be a problem for the birds. But today what you'll see on the internet are photographs of dead albatross chicks, sliced open, chock full of plastic, some of which is not good, would not be a good thing for a mother to put in its chick, like really sharp, pointy stuff, and plastic bags. There's no way that the mother albatross is going to give a plastic bag to its chick, but that's what David Attenborough says, even though he never shows it. And so these are fake, staged pictures. And go on the internet and you will see them. And even the Smithsonian buys into it. Greenpeace buys into it. All these people buy into it, when in fact it is a perfectly beneficial and harmless thing that the adult birds are doing by giving these properly sized and shaped, rounded, usually from being on the beach or being eroded or just being that way in the first place, but they're not sharp. You can see it in the photograph I have. It's from a video, and it's the only photograph I know of which is showing a mother seabird providing its chick with bits of plastic, but there it is. It's true. And they've known about it for a long time, though, because scientists have gone out onto these islands, and when they find a dead chick, they generally open it up to see what's going on inside it, as a kind of like a mortician would. And so those are two things about plastic that nobody understands. And the fact that there is no Pacific garbage patch at all. There's a lot of discarded fishing gear in the oceans, and nets in particular are a worry in that they can catch fish, but then something will eat those fish if they're caught in a net. So
what do you make of the decrease in fish populations, though? Our friend Milton Love down at UC Santa Barbara has some pretty convincing data from studying the rockfish populations that, and really,
well, overfishing is very prevalent, and I'm totally in favor. Here we have this coral reef, the largest on the west coast of the Americas, in Cabo Pulmo in southern Baja, on the Sea of Cortez, and that reef is now a sanctuary since 1996. And the fish have come back really well. And the sharks, which had been reduced from, I think, 16 species to 2, are back up to 12 again. So marine protected areas are a really important thing, especially reefs and rocky places. And the sea has been overfished in many parts, especially the international waters where there's no control. And yet the environmental movement is generally against aquaculture. In other words, growing salmon in the ocean or growing tilapia or whatever. They're opposed to it, even though now it's about 50% of all marine product. And it was, I had a salmon farm for 8 years where I grew up on the north end of Vancouver Island in Winter Harbor. And so I know the industry well. I was president of our association just when it was getting started in the mid 1980s. At that time, less than 5% of seafood was from farming, mostly shrimp at that time. And the koi in China, I forget, they got a proper name, which they've been farming for thousands of years. But in fresh water, marine fish farming didn't really start till the Norwegians started growing salmon. And now 50% of all, and I think most people agree that fish is healthier than red meat, or at least you should don't eat red meat all the time, eat fish some of the time. That if you're a meat eater like me. And so yes, it's a real problem, especially in the Atlantic, where there are so many countries vying for the same fish populations offshore. And that's why the codfish collapsed, we think, and has come back to some extent now that they've put some rules in place. But it's easier in the Pacific because Russia, Japan, United States, and Canada, if they all agree on something in the North Pacific, and there are treaties for crabs, there's treaties for salmon. So it's a much better regime in the North Pacific than it is in the North Atlantic, and it's largely because of political factors. There's 25 countries fishing from Europe and only 5 or 4 from the West.
I want to go back to the plastic question for a second, because I just found a paper where they took plastics and they put them into deionized water, and then they tested the effects of the deionized water on the survival of this like freshwater eukaryote, and they see decreases in survival. Like there's something that's coming off the plastic.
There's so much fake science, Anastasia, going on in this world today, and most of it's got to do with climate change, but a lot of it has to do with plastic. The war on plastic is a proxy for the war on fossil fuels. The plastics are almost all made from fossil fuels.
Of course,
and if you ended the use of fossil fuels, you would strip your house practically bare.
I absolutely understand that. And, like, I struggle with this all the time because I think that there is, look.
There's a lot of motivation here, for sure.
There's a lot of motivation here. And I think that it's worth going back to this question of, are humans natural or unnatural? And is what we do good or bad? Because
everything is natural, Anastasia. Everything.
Right. But
the word unnatural is a political or religious word. Unnatural doesn't mean isn't here.
I agree. I agree. I agree that the word natural is used to create.
I mean, the only possible consistent use of the word natural is in opposition to synthetic or artificial. So you can only say whether humans made it or not. That's the only possible use. Yes, otherwise, it's a completely meaningless word.
And the things that humans make are natural.
They're natural, but they're also artificial. Would you agree?
By definition.
No, they're not artificial. Artificial means fake, means phony.
No, artificial also can mean that it is, let's say,
just
a compound.
Product of craftsmanship.
Yeah, so it's like we had this really interesting conversation with this guy named Lee Cronin who works on something called the Computer, and so he's basically trying to make like a Star Trek 3D printer. I think he's at the University of Glasgow, and as part of his chemistry work, he also works with Sarah Imari Walker, who's at Arizona State University, who's an astrobiologist, and they came up with a definition for life that's called assembly theory. And it has to do with the complexity of a molecule that is detected. So if you can detect a molecule that requires, any more than I think 10 assembly steps in order to make, then they peg that as the bar for having been created by life. And so there is a certain amount of complexity that is just normal biological complexity that is produced by cellular machinery on a biochemical level. What humans do is we go one step beyond that, right? Because instead of depending on what our bodies can do, we depend on what our technology can do. We're a technological species by definition, much more so than any other living being that we've ever known. And so when we talk about, artificial, I think that what we're saying is that it is a step removed from biosynthesis. These are compounds that are not made by life, and so life has not evolved in their presence. And by virtue of not having evolved in its presence, it's possible for it to be damaging. And so I think
it's possible for lots of things that were here before we were to be damaging too.
And many of them are, right? Like cyanide, arsenic,
Right.
the
So I don't see
uranium,
why
plutonium.
you would even bother making a distinction other than this was created by human engineering and technology.
Exactly.
That's the reason,
But
yeah.
not calling it artificial or unnatural or some negative
synthetic.
sounding word.
I mean, we need a word for it.
I think
Synthetic.
synthetic.
Works.
Yeah, because I think that there is this tendency to commit the fallacy of nature, which is that there was a time, it's kind of the Garden of Eden logical fallacy. That
Back
there
to
was
nature
back
fallacy?
the back to nature fallacy, exactly, where there was a time and a place where humans lived in perfect harmony with their environment, and they didn't have any negative effects on the environment, and it was a great time, and we should go back to that. And that's probably before the dawn of agriculture, and so that's small tribes of hunter-gatherers or whatever. And I think that that's insidious, and I think not. I have many reasons why I don't agree with that as being the right choice for humans. However, that said, I think that it's worth recognizing that people live in really polluted environments. Like we live right now in the country, and we had this really crazy experience where we had termites. And somebody came out and looked at what we had, and they were like, okay, well, what you're going to do is you're going to dig a trench around your entire house, and you're going to dump this insecticide into the trench, and you're going to bury it. And that's going to stop the termites. And it also happens to stop a bunch of other, insects and mites that are in the soil.
I'm sure.
And the thing is that everybody out here is on a well. And when you ask them, like, hey, well, what about the groundwater? It's not like they test the soil to see what the motility of the chemical is in the soil. They're like, nah, it's fine.
The scary thing for me seems to be that the information channels for assessing all of these things, and this is a topic that comes up over and over and over again on our show, is that a lot of the science that we do is motivated. It's not necessarily always motivated by some sort of financial gains. In fact, most people who are participating in science don't even totally realize the motivations that are underlying their research. And so it's very scary to me that as we have access to all of this information, we have a sea of information and we don't know how to pick out the pieces that are useful and the pieces that are just motivating some other process, like whatever, political, financial, whatever it could be.
Well, I'll give you a thumbnail. About 80% of all the research done in the United States in science is in universities. That money is coming almost all from the government. Companies like 3M and Chrysler, they're not researching climate change. They are researching how to make things better and build stuff. They're doing real science. But much of this university research, the quiet part of the climate change circle, is the money going from the politicians through their bureaucrats to the scientists in the universities. Then comes the noise. The scientist gives the politician and the media his great findings, and it's all over the news. And then Greenpeace gets hold of it. And then, the fake news media gets hold of it and blows it all out of proportion. That's what's going on right now.
Yeah, do you see a way back from that?
I do not. I have no idea. I'm 76 years old and I haven't figured it out yet. And I'm just making a joke really there.
It seems like you need to have alternative institutions that are not part of that system in order to repopulate the scientific landscape with something that's more closely approximating objectivity.
Because we know that the same way that we can't trust, let's say, a lot of the science that comes out of universities, we also can't trust corporations to regulate themselves. Like, there's always an incentive to disregard safety concerns for your blockbuster chemical. Like, this is what happened with DuPont
if you can get away with it.
And people do. This is what happened with DuPont and the Teflon waste products. Like, there's tons of literature from their internal documents that they knew that stuff was causing cancer, and they were still dumping it in the Ohio River.
And I guess the note of optimism is that it seems like if people can get together and start and fund independent research organizations, that might have a chance at addressing the issue.
Right, like we live in Southern Oregon, and like the water in the rivers that runs through the town is dirty. It smells. It smells like septic systems. It smells like chemicals. There's not really a lot of fish in the water. And when you look at the ways that the water is being tested, most of the organizations that are involved in testing only look at coliform bacteria. And that's certainly one aspect of cleanliness. But there's, I
Well, that's
feel
the
like,
sewage side of it. You can't have a river full of sewage, or they would block it from being used at the very least, and then they would find out where it's coming from and clean it up.
and they find every single summer there's tons of river beaches that get closed because there's big contamination with coliform bacteria, and the problem is that there's not a single leak where there's a sewage plant that's leaking it. It's the fact that there's 50,000 people that are on septic tanks next to creeks that
Yeah, that's an
that
issue.
right? And so it's like I'm concerned on a level that it goes beyond the environmental lobby or goes beyond the talking points of Greenpeace. Like I think that there really is a DDT level event that's happening in the world right now, and we're not focused on finding it
Well,
because
if people would focus on what really is pollution instead of CO2, it would make a big difference, because most of the money is going towards CO2.
and I
100%.
and I totally
100%.
agree with you that it's like it's a
100%.
terrible misappropriation of funds where we talked to Daniel Pauly, who, do you know him? He was a
I know that
fisheries
name,
scientist
yes.
for
Yeah.
Canada.
Yeah.
And it was
Fellow BC man,
was he?
I believe so.
That's how I know his name, probably from the Federal Fisheries Research place in
Yeah.
Nanaimo.
And so he basically admitted, he was like, look, the CO2 question is a lever. It's an organizing principle that allows us to have regulations put into place on industry. And once we're able to have those regulations passed, then we will be able to turn to other questions because we'll have exercised our political organization and our political power in a directed enough way that allows us to get to the next step.
Except that there's two things. First, there's the effort to eliminate fossil fuels, which is presently more than 80% of the world's energy. And without energy, this is just basically, without energy, there is no motion. Without motion, there is no time. So they're fairly fundamental.
Absolutely.
And so we need energy. And if we want to have a life that is better than the drudgery of life was until about 200 years ago, we need technology, and we need energy to power that technology, like giant machines that dig ore out of the ground so you can have something made out of steel. And this whole thing now being so totally focused on wind and solar is absolutely preposterous. And if you read today's edition of the Manhattan Contrarian, Francis Menton is his name. He's a senior person in Manhattan in, I forget which field it is, insurance or something like that, but he's a brilliant intellect. And he is following this whole question very closely. And now Elon Musk has come out with a statement from Tesla that is a large 200 some odd page paper on how we can eliminate fossil fuels from our energy system by using wind and solar. And as Francis says, at least it's not quite so suicidal that he doesn't think batteries are the only way to deal with the intermittency of wind and solar. He's banking 90% on hydrogen. There's a reason that hydrogen fuel cells have never come into existence. There's a reason why green hydrogen costs 20 times as much as natural gas. And it's not going to happen.
And those reasons, as far as I understand them, is the fact that in order to be able to transport and use hydrogen, you have to have a lot of energy input in order to compress it because it's not
That's the
naturally
first step.
liquid.
There was also the Hindenburg too, right?
Yeah, it's
That's the first step, and the other issues are that it's far more explosive than natural gas.
That's
and
the
so there's a
Hindenburg
really,
option.
really,
It turns
really, really
steel. It
interesting.
turns steel brittle, so you can't put it in steel pipes.
Hmm.
Not only that, you have to have much larger pipes because it is so much less dense than natural gas, or have massive compressors, which they do with natural gas as well, but that hydrogen would need 5 times as much compression as natural gas, or some number along those lines. And
There was a really
The-
interesting study the other day, actually, where they were working on the hydrogen storage and transport problem, where what they had done is they had doped some kind of chemical lattice with hydrogen. And what they did is they basically, in a gigantic steel drum, they had this powder at the bottom of it, and then they added ball bearings in a hydrogen atmosphere. And as you rotate the drum, the ball bearings break the chemical lattice, and the hydrogen binds to that chemical lattice, and then that becomes your storage mechanism, this inert powder. You can transport the powder at room temperature and then heat it, I think, to like, I don't want to exaggerate, but somewhere between 70 and 100 degrees Celsius. And once you heat it, then the hydrogen escapes, and so it removes the energy intensity of compression at the very least. And so I guess what
things are all entirely theoretical at this point.
this was actually a demonstrated test.
Yeah, but it wasn't a
theoretical
4-foot
test.
diameter steel pipe going
No,
halfway
and
across
so-
the country.
But
and
I think that you wouldn't need a pipe because you're transporting dry powder, and so it wouldn't be piped. It would be probably
you've turned the hydrogen into dry powder?
Yeah.
What's the formula?
I can pull the paper and I can send it to you.
No,
It was
but I
really
mean, it's got to be hydrogen something. It's just not hydrogen.
no, exactly. So it's like they use an inert carrier molecule that
Yeah,
they
but
can.
why did they bother making the hydrogen in the first place?
Well, because they're trying to solve the hydrogen storage problem.
Yeah, but they haven't.
Well, they have because they're able to take. I think that they're able to just extract it from air. Like, it was a really crazy paper. It was a proof of concept that you could do it by putting this chemical into a metal drum with ball bearings, breaking the chemical lattice. The hydrogen binds to the chemical lattice. You
What
have a
chemical lattice are you speaking
Let me
of?
find it. Let me find it.
Yeah.
But my point that I
You
think
know
that I wanted.
a lot of things I've never heard about before,
I
Anastasia.
read a lot. I read a lot.
Yeah, well, so do I.
I mean, Anastasia worked for a long time as the mountain guide, and she's been very keyed into the forests and how it feels in the different woodlands we visit. And you do get a sense for when the forest is unhappy, and it often does accompany interesting human industry in the area. There's a very real sense of that, and so
I grew up in the forest.
yeah, me too.
My family has been in the forest industry for over 100 years. On Vancouver Island, my honors bachelor of science is in forestry and biology. And I'll just tell you one short story. By about 1750, 1800, the forests of Europe had been reduced to less than 10% of the area of Europe, due to the fact that wood was the only energy source they had. There was no coal or oil or natural gas. So steel was being made with wood, and glassworks were being run with wood, and every building was heated with wood, and all the cooking was done with wood. So this was the first time in the history of civilization, because of the industrialization of Europe, that the forests were just running out. They were cutting them faster than they were growing, in other words. Today, 43% of Europe is forested because of fossil fuels and silviculture. Those two things hand in hand. The art of growing trees, of breeding them, planting them, and growing trees that grow faster. And now that the CO2 level has gone up in the atmosphere by around 50% since we started using fossil fuels, mostly since about 1850, and then even more right after the Second World War, the exponential use of fossil fuels. Now all the forests in the world and all the crops in the world are growing much faster than they did before we started using fossil fuels, because we are fertilizing the atmosphere with CO2, which had been drawn down to such low levels during the most recent glacial maximum. I never call it the last glacial maximum because that could mean the final one, like you say. But I call it the most recent glacial maximum out of about 40 or 45 that have occurred during this Pleistocene ice age, we are restoring life to this earth. We are its salvation, in that if we hadn't come along, the shellfish, which evolved 500 million years ago, including the coral reefs, taking calcium and carbon dioxide out of the seawater to make their shells, caused CO2 to go from 10,000 down to 180 parts per million at the most recent glacial maximum. It then rose up to 260 during the 10,000 years as we came out of the most recent glacial maximum, because when the oceans warm, they give off gases. When oceans cool, they absorb gases. So that's why it went down to 180 at the glacial maximum, because the oceans had absorbed a lot of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So to go before that, before the 2.5 million years ago, there was 250 million years of warmer climate than there is today. And then you have the Karoo Ice Age, which ended 250 million years ago, which started 350 million years ago. In other words, it was a 100 million year glacial period. We're in one that's only 2.5 million years on. We don't know why they set in. We have no clue as to what astronomical or solar or tectonic, there's so many variables. We just don't know what makes ice ages happen. But we know we're in one now. And there's all kinds of people who are claiming that we're not in the ice age anymore, that we are now in the Anthropocene. And they've reclassified, even at the international level of the Commission on Stratigraphy, they have classified the Holocene as an epoch now, or epoch, depending. I think epoch's better because epic can also be an epic film. But epoch, now it's not an it's an epoch. Now the Pleistocene Ice Age is an epoch. So therefore they have basically declared that the Pleistocene Ice Age is over and we are now in the Holocene epoch, rather than being honest about it, that this interglacial period is in no way different from the 8 or 10 before it. And probably all the way back, because the graph shows very clearly this up and down pattern through this 2.5 million years, which shows the glacial maximums and the interglacial periods. So this is corrupt right to the core of the international science committees and the IPCC and all of them. They are all fully and totally politically corrupt. And the reason the IPCC can get away with what it's doing is because its mandate is to look at human influence on the climate. They are not even mandated to look at any natural influence on the climate, even though obviously before we started burning fossil fuels, there was lots of natural influences on the climate because it changed a lot over the period of millions of years. And here you've got this little wee short time right now where we happen to be coming out of the little ice age. Therefore, it's getting a little bit warmer. And we happen to be putting a bunch of CO2 back into the environment, which is a good thing, 100%, except it's being demonized as the cause of catastrophic global warming and climate emergency and climate crisis and blah, blah, blah. So
it's interesting. We had a gentleman on the show who had this fantastic blog called The Pleistocene Murderers. And his thesis boiled down to this idea that the Earth essentially made humans for the sheer purpose of restoring carbon to the atmosphere. And it was so hard to get him to say it on the show, but it was clearly the conclusion of his big, work. But he was just it's such a viscerally disturbing thing to put outright. He did this analysis of the different carbon cycles, and it was actually quite compelling.
I use the term inadvertently. We didn't do this in order to save life. We did it in order to have energy. And there it was. And that energy was made from life. So that's a cool part of it too. I don't know why people want to demonize something that was made by life. But that's another matter. But the truth of the matter is the shellfish that evolved in the Cambrian explosion, they had no shells when multicellular life first emerged. Everything was like a jellyfish. Mm-hmm. But when they learned to combine calcium with carbon dioxide to make their shells, it's like a knight in armor compared to a naked person, right? And so it was a huge advantage for survival. to have this shell. And you look now at oysters and clams and barnacles and mussels and coral reefs, which are responsible for about 50% of all the calcification in the oceans. And during this Pleistocene, the oceans have gone up and down approximately 400 feet per cycle. Every time the oceans go up 400 feet, the coral reefs have to follow them up and build 400 feet of new coral. And every time the coral reefs, the sea level goes down, that coral dies from the top down until they're back down to 400 feet below sea level, our sea level now. So 40 times that's happened. And each time the coral has had to put another whole huge layer. So that is why there's 100 million billion tons of carbon in carbonaceous rocks. Limestone, chalk, marble, and dolomite are all of life origin. They didn't come out of a volcano like granite did. They came from life making these shells. And that life inadvertently presaged the end of life by doing that. Because eventually they would suck so much CO2. It was just a door slamming. It's a little breezy here. It wasn't a assassin.
Not a ghost.
Not yet.
No. So they didn't know they were doing that, but they did it. And it was for a very good reason. But it was going to end up reducing CO2 to such a level that all the plants would begin to die. As a matter of fact, they believed during the most recent glacial maximum, the higher elevation plants did die because there are a layer of ash in the sediment that indicates they burned. And they would burn if they were dried out and caught fire. And so it's a hypothesis, but it's a likely one because as you go up in elevation, the air thins. And so 180 ppm at the atmosphere is a higher quantity of CO2 than it is at 10,000 feet. So it's very plausible that was the beginning and that the next glacial maximum would take it down even lower. You can see it just in the last 4 that it went down, 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 not by much, but enough to be down. And to go from 10,000 to 180 is a pretty big drop. And it was probably more than 10,000 before the Cambrian explosion, because that was only 500 million years ago. Life evolved somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, but was pretty small biomass. It was basically microscopic algae in the sea. And so it wasn't until multicellular life forms emerged. And then when the forests emerged on land, it went up by another order of magnitude at least. Because if you think about how much biomass there is in a forest compared to, say, all the people in a city, if you look at a mountain around us, I mean, there's the biomass of just that one forest is more than everybody in the whole city. And I always think of the fact that then we come along 500 million years later when there's an emergency of low CO2 and we start putting it back in the atmosphere inadvertently. I mean, we weren't burning the fossil fuels in order to increase the CO2 in the atmosphere. We're not that, we shouldn't be that proud of ourselves for having done it, but we should recognize that that's what we're doing instead of demonizing ourselves for putting the stuff of life back into the atmosphere and oceans again. That's what we're doing. And so I feel really happy about that. And I do not feel a sense of doom and gloom, except for at the political level where we've gone completely crazy right now, as far as I can see. But we won't get into that.
Well, I think that what you're saying about CO2 is reasonable. Like looking at the historical record, looking at the explosion of fear over the presence of this relatively innocuous molecule, like it's hard to argue with. Like, so let's take that as a baseline. But I think that there's a lot of other things that get built on top of that paint a more complicated picture. And so before I get into that, I want to say that the compound is called boron nitride that they use for the mechanical milling. And it's called ball milling, and
Is it got a formula that has an H in it?
No, there's something about when you break the crystal lattice of the boron nitride that the hydrogen gets absorbed after the compound has broken. So you have a crystal lattice of boron nitride.
Yes.
And then when that breaks, it can absorb a hydrogen onto it.
Yeah, well, I'll like to see the paper.
I'll send you the paper. I think that obviously it's still really in early days. It's an Australian researcher who we should get on the show. His name's Ian Chen.
Is he in a university?
He is at a university, but he's a material scientist, and so they're trying to figure out material science approaches to being able to solve these problems.
Well, the idea of making something that could absorb and then release a gas is an interesting one. But the scale we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean I think that the real problem that people have is that humans have evolved in wilderness. We have evolved in natural spaces that, and I say natural in the sense of not being built up or paved or altered in such a way that we chase all of the animals out of the space. Like we have evolved to live amongst wildlife. And most people don't have that experience anymore because cities are deeply inhospitable places for wildlife. And so the panic that people feel, I think, is a panic at the disappearance of the animals that we've always shared the planet with. And I think
cities take up about 2.5% of the land surface.
So what Shiloh mentioned, that I used to work as a guide, and so Oregon is a timber heavy state, and I would take people up Mount Adams, I would take people up Mount St. Helens, I would take them around the forests around Mount Hood, we would go on the Pacific Crest Trail. These are areas that are pretty isolated, no cell phone reception, and there's no animals. The forests are empty, and it's creepy because there's no birds, there's no squirrels. In the entire time of guiding, I saw one buck. And it gives you this feeling of unease because you go out into the woods and you expect there to be wildlife, but there isn't.
Maybe they heard you coming.
I mean, entirely possible, but it's like you would we go fishing here and there's no fish in the rivers. Like there's something that is really spooky.
Where do you live?
We live in Southern Oregon.
And there's no fish in the rivers?
I mean, there's fish in the rivers where there's fisheries, where they put the fish in the rivers, but in the wild rivers where there's no fisheries, there's almost no fish. And so
maybe there were always almost no fish in those rivers. I don't know.
I think there's another piece of this puzzle too, which is that the climate is always changing on Earth, and people are really lacking a sense of power over that. Right, the sea. I think something like 80% of the world lives within 60 miles of the coast, and historically, humans have always depended on the coast, and depended on all of our big cities out here on the West Coast are on the coast, and so people are very genuinely worried about sea level rise. And if somebody can come along from an authority base and tell them that they know what to do about it, you just take all the CO2 out, then sure, that sounds like a great plan if it's going to save my city.
Except that the sea isn't rising fast enough I have 2 points about sea level rise. One, you will not have to run. And two, hire the Dutch if you want to protect your property. Because 25% of Holland is below sea level. And they're going to keep it that way for a long, long time. But I think 2 millimeters a year.
Sure. So it's like sea level rise is going to affect island nations like the Maldives or something.
You know why? Because coral reefs grow up with the sea level. All those Pacific islands are coral. And when the sea rises, the coral rises with it. It did it from 400 feet below sea level to get where it is now. So it's not going to have any trouble keeping up with 2 millimeters a year. And the fact is, the sea level rose really fast coming out of the most recent glacial maximum. The graph is like this and then levels off about 6,000 years ago to pretty well flat. And that's where we are now. Have you seen that graph?
I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense.
It's on Wikipedia.
There's also flood myths in every single culture going back to the same period.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a crazy period of flooding that happened at the end of the last glacial maximum.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is it just seems like people are very, like, nature is something you try to keep at bay at all times as a human being. Like, your life depends upon it at some fundamental level. We don't want the outside inside of our house. And so when somebody comes along and says that they can take care of that and they can control nature, right? Gavin, when we had him on the show, was absolutely convinced that we'd be able to manage the climate, period. Like, we can just change the climate. That's like, if you start with the assumption that humans are changing the climate and we're capable of directing that.
That's only slightly egotistical.
It's
And that's
wild,
what
right?
Gavin is, unfortunately. He's very egotistical. I've debated him on stage,
Hmm.
and he's not very impressive. Actually, he keeps talking about his iconic hockey stick or whatever.
I mean,
Uses
I
the-
think that the problem here, let's say that CO2 is not the thing that is worth worrying about. I think that the rivers, I mean,
I'm most worried about the information channels being corrupt. I see that as the biggest existential threat personally. It's like if people can't, like a democracy doesn't work if people don't have access to clean information. Like forget clean water. Like clean information is the most vital thing to us making any decisions about the environment or anything else.
I
And that's,
agree with that
I
very
just can't,
much. Yeah.
that's what it all comes down to for me is
Yeah, well, that's the problem is almost all the news media are bought off one way or another now. In Canada, we have a prime minister who came into power and gave the media $600 million, calling it a bailout or something. And he's bought them basically, and he's promised to give them more. So we've got a situation here where we don't even have a Fox News or any equivalent like it. We have no countervailing information.
Yeah, it's
And
worse than that. I mean, this video might get taken off YouTube, for all I know.
well, they always
It's
put the
very
United
possible
Nations
anyways.
banner over everything I do.
hmm,
So
The
yeah, maybe
United
we'll just get a
Nations
banner.
says that climate change is caused by human beings or something. And I'm not denying the fact that our civilization would have some perturbation on weather and things like if you cut all the trees down in a place, it changes the rainfall pattern and stuff like that. But it doesn't necessarily mean the Earth is going to die tomorrow, because the Sahara Desert was green from coast to coast up until about 6,000 years ago during the first part of the Holocene, what's called the Holocene climatic optimum, when it was warmer than it is now. Why was it warmer than it is now when CO2 was only 280 ppm? When now
right.
it's 425 and it's not as warm as it was then. So there's all these questions that you only need about 5 facts to realize that we're being hoodwinked here. That this is not a climate emergency. And that flood that just happened in California, I read about that. They've been failing to deal with those levees for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, the whole Sacramento Valley to the north was a lake at one time, every time it rained heavily, and they've ditched it and dammed it, or what they call levees. I always like that word. It's kind of a southern word, though. We don't use that in Canada. We say dam. And
Well, it is
so
funny. The infrastructure is just totally unprepared for it. It's funny because we live between Oregon and California, and we
yeah,
drove through that huge rainstorm in California, and it was a lot of water. But it's funny because up in Oregon, it would just be like no factor at all.
yeah.
The streets are perfectly capable of draining water, and people know how to drive in it. And it was just like a complete natural disaster in California. It's been in a drought for 30 years, so they don't know what to do.
Well,
Infrastructure
yeah,
was
that's one
built up
day
without.
they're screaming that it's inevitable drought going to last forever, and then they get upset when it floods. So you have to take. I mean, you just have to take the weather. There's really good research showing that over the last 100 years, there's been more than a 90% reduction in weather-related deaths on a population basis, and that's because we build better infrastructure now. And my favorite example is the tsunami in Japan. That tsunami was 9.1 or so on the Richter scale, about as strong as they get. Nobody died from a building falling down in Japan because they know how to build buildings that can withstand earthquakes. Unfortunately, 20,000 people died from the tsunami, which is pretty hard to do much about. And that was a tragedy. Oh, and so back to the Pacific garbage patch. The only picture you will see that is a real photograph of the Pacific garbage patch on the internet, most of them are paintings. So it's just a fake thing that they've done. A big blob in the middle of the Pacific Ocean said this is a Pacific garbage patch. But the one that shows a huge mass of debris on the ocean, with a diver coming up in it dramatically, they say this is part of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's written underneath it. I looked at the background and I said to myself, there's mountains in the background. There are no mountains in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's Japan. And it's all the debris that was swept into the water from the tsunami. I think that's kind of rude to say that that's what it is, when in fact it's the remains of hundreds of towns and thousands of people getting washed into the water and dying. So I just think that's rather rude. But then the other thing
such effective propaganda because people are generally motivated by wanting to do the right thing. They really do want to take care of the world and take care of the planet. That's what's so sad about these corrupted public messaging systems that we have that are really just ripping the place to shreds and just under our feet right now, is that they tap into the compassion and they tap into people's sense of wanting to do what's right. And people are just acting out that play because that's who they see themselves as.
You're so right about that.
One of the things that we want to do is we want to be able to actually have, like Shiloh mentioned this at the beginning, it's like you tell stories on the basis of data. And the data is collected in centralized networks, and there is a universal problem with the way that the data is collected and interpreted, and then the way that it's applied for political purposes. And there's no way to differentiate science from politics at this point, because we have moved away from religion as being the organizing basis, and science is the new religion. And so if there is a consensus among scientists, whether or not they have spent a lot of time looking into the data or the way the data is gathered, you have plausible deniability for choosing to do anything else. And so you do this thing that is, I think that the reason that everybody likes CO2 is because it's easy, because the corporations can put up CO2 capture devices and they can deal with the thing, they can buy offsets, and they can say we have solved the problem without having to deal with any of the foundational material problems of civilization.
And it makes the consumer feel good because I buy green coffee, or I have a green
carbon sequestration
heating system.
You know that is such a phony thing. They say they're going to capture huge amounts of. It takes more energy to capture the CO2 than it did to get it in the first place.
Yeah,
so it's completely impossible. It just can't happen.
I think
and yet they're getting government grants to build carbon capture facilities.
Yeah.
So it's all our money going into the toilet because it's not going to help anything, and it is really frustrating to have gone through all these years of study and action. When I left Greenpeace, I didn't stop being an activist. I ran a campaign to allow golden rice in the tropical countries where rice is the staple food. And unfortunately, rice has no beta carotene in it, like any green thing does. Carrots have, of course, and basically any red or yellow vegetable that's beta carotene, and that's what we make vitamin A out of. And vitamin A deficiency is the biggest cause of child death in the world. And also pregnant women because they're feeding Tritu. And a kid in an urban slum or a remote village in the country, there's the two subsets of situations. If all they get is a cup of rice a day, they go blind and then they die. And because we used to think that vitamin A was just for eyesight, but it's not only that, it's also essential for your immune system. And so I campaigned with my brother and my wife, and we brought together quite a few other people in film and video, and we took the message to 30 million people in 9 countries. In Europe, where Greenpeace is the protagonist or antagonist or whatever you call it, the bad guy, promoting this campaign against golden rice because it's a GMO. And we said, look, you can be for GMOs all you want, but make one humanitarian exception for this particular kind of rice because it's been tested on children. And then what they did, they got the people in China who did the testing with government approval. They got them all fired at the top level for abuse of children, for giving and they proved that the vitamin A was just as good as spinach and carrots and some other thing at delivering vitamin A to the kids. And it was a very emotional and frustrating situation to see my old organization campaigning in a situation that was going to kill 1 million to 2 million children every year forever. It's still happening. It has only been approved by one country, that's Bangladesh. and it still isn't being grown in large enough volumes. Philippines is where the International Rice Research Institute is. They have the Environment Ministry, with the pressure from Greenpeace, has refused to let the government pass it, the right to use it. It was grown in the Mississippi, where the rice fields are there, and perfected there with money from the international companies involved in fertilizer and stuff that helped with it and got it to work properly. It was ready to use in 1993, and it still hasn't been used. 30 years later, or whatever this is. And it's so frustrating to have that campaign. We, as I say, though, we reached 30 million people. But the interesting thing is there were hundreds of campaigners against GMO. The for GMO people were basically all scientists and bureaucrats. None of them were campaigning for golden rice. We were the only people who ever campaigned for golden rice, and I gave up at a certain point because it was just too much. But we raised the money to do it, and we fought the good fight, and that's all you can do in the end. Because we, even in Greenpeace, we didn't always win every battle we had, but pretty much we did. But it was when they came to chlorine, and I want to just mention that chlorine's not only an essential nutrient as sodium chloride, but adding it to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health, and putting it in pools and spas to prevent cholera and other waterborne communicable diseases. And 85% of our pharmaceuticals are made with chlorine chemistry, and 25% of them have chlorine in them. So the idea of banning chlorine worldwide, I said, you guys got to be slightly more nuanced on this campaign. And if you think there's certain chlorine chemicals that aren't restricted or banned sufficiently enough, like the DDT was the central point of this whole thing, in the irresponsible one size fits all sort of mentality from the environmental community. It was right to ban DDT for broad scale agricultural application. It was for one thing, it killed every insect, and there's lots of pesticides now that are much more specific on killing the target insect. And there's many GMOs, such as the Roundup Ready type, that only the insect that is attacking the actual crop is harmed. And like the cotton in India is the best example in the world we have, where it doubled in production when they started using GM cotton. And all it has is a chemical in the cotton which hurts insects, just Lepidoptera, not even all insects, just moths and butterflies. And where was I going with that? Oh, yes. But using DDT to prevent malaria by putting it inside the home on the walls in a light spray, because when people are sitting down at dinner at dusk is when the mosquitoes attack. And nobody's going to put nets over themselves to eat dinner. Maybe when they're sleeping, but not when they're eating. And so by spraying the walls with a little bit of DDT, there's an absolute science on this between Mozambique and South Africa. South Africa refused to go along with banning DDT for malaria control, whereas Mozambique was blackmailed by the international community, saying that if we'll cut off all our aid to you, whereas South Africa didn't need any aid, at least not at that time. And so the Mozambique DDT went rampant, and in South Africa it was controlled. And it's not a nice thing to die from, and you shouldn't have to die anyways. Not that young, as some people did. So there's so many sides to these issues. Some of them arguably are a serious problem, but one of the most serious problems we have is that now about 80% of all people in the industrial world live in urban environments where they are not seeing what's really going on in the woods or the farms. And I believe that most of the world is in pretty good health. I've been all over this planet. I guess you could say that a city is a wreckage or a ruin or a destruction if you want to, but it's where the people live. It's their hive. But when there was more people in the country, like at one time, only about 15% of the people lived in the castle. and the rest of them were out doing stoop labor in agriculture and not living to be very old. And so the beauty of mechanization is that it has meant that young children don't have to work in slave labor on farms. It meant they can get educated. It means that women can be emancipated because urban situations are more suitable for women's employment in business and bureaucracy and science and whatever, teaching. And so that's the good side of mechanization and technology. But the bad side of it is this now situation where the people in the city are being taught to think that the people in the country are destroying the earth. The people who are cutting and drilling and plowing and digging and fishing and hunting and whatever they're doing out there and killing cows and sheep, that they're the enemy because they're the ones destroying the earth, forgetting while they sleep at night that the trucks come in with all the food for them and stock the shelves in the supermarket. So,
there's a really strong sense of that where we live, actually. And I try to always bring that up when I'm hanging out with city people. You know, we spend a good portion of our time down in the metropolis. And it's interesting because the people in the country feel very threatened by the city people, but the city people almost don't notice the country people are even there. And in our country, it is where the greatest political divide is as well. There's not like blue states versus red states like it's depicted. It's really the country and the city, and they have very different interests. And that alienation of those two populations is very strange. And I think it's also very alienating to not really understand where your food comes from. And that seems like that's a really jarring disconnect.
yeah.
For
Or
people.
your steel or your concrete or your plastic or your everything, right?
I mean, I think that there's a desire to see humans have less of a footprint. And I think that this is what this all comes down to, which is that we live in a pretty wasteful society, right? We get stuff like the fashion industry, for example. This is one of the biggest problems where there's these companies that create massive quantities of cheap clothes that are intended to be worn once or twice before they start to fall apart. And there's a tremendous amount of labor and material inputs that goes into the production of those things that are not meant to survive. Like you go to
computers, cell phones, similar.
Yeah, like everything is disposable. And I think that people are really reacting to the fact that they recognize that that isn't a very responsible way to live. And they recognize also that the fact that they're surrounded by these things is the product of marketing and psychological warfare in the purest sense of getting people to buy stuff that they wouldn't otherwise want or need. Like Adam Curtis makes really fantastic documentaries, and he made one called The Century of the Self, which is this, I mean, it's an epic, it's an epic exploration of the emergence of PR and marketing at the turn of the 20th century, where before people didn't differentiate themselves on the basis of the possessions that they accumulated. And that meant that...
When did that start?
That started
right after the war, I think. It was directly dissenting.
After World War I, yeah.
Was it World War I?
Yeah, because he was talking about the suffragettes and the torches of liberty. So there was this guy named Ed Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, who was the first PR man that really realized that it was possible to use psychological cues to get people to want to buy stuff.
Well, you could take propaganda and actually use it to make money, which was a brand new idea. And it really just came down to providing people with multiple options and enter competition within a brand. You know, you have 3 different toothpastes instead of one.
And so basically,
if I had one thing to focus on in terms of wastefulness, I would pick garbage, as it's so called. In Europe, primarily the Western part of Europe as opposed to the eastern part of Europe, they do not have any landfills. The waste materials, as things that people don't want, are divided into recyclable and non-recyclable. Like, for example, the demolition of a wooden house with short pieces of wood full of nails is not, you cannot build something with that. So you put it in a landfill. The same with a lot of the plastic, especially the film plastic, and a lot of different plastic gets put in landfills. In Western Europe, all of that material goes to a waste to energy plant or energy from waste plant. They get 4% of their entire electricity from burning that waste and collecting the nails as in a molten form at the bottom. Any metals come out and get recycled. And it's only combustibles, the main ones, which are wood, paper, and plastic, right? Glass and metals can all be recycled 100%, but you can't recycle 100% of the organic stuff. So therefore, it's best, and the environmental community in North America opposes waste to energy plants. And therefore, 50% or more of all our waste ends up in a landfill, which is a big rotting heap of garbage. Instead
Which
of
is
using
a bit ironic because they're huge proponents of biochar, right? They'll burn wood, but they don't want to burn wood that's already cut down.
No, they're against wood now too. Basically, the environmental movement is against combustion. In other words, the burning of anything.
I think on the East Coast they do biochar a fair amount. At least the last time I lived out there, it was labeled as a green power source though, which is
what are they doing
silly.
with it? Well,
they
actually,
burn it. They're just wood chips. Yeah, they do a lot of that out here too.
Long Island does have a waste to energy plant, and so does Minneapolis, St. Paul, and maybe there's others. But the vast majority of waste that cannot be recycled in the U.S. and Canada goes to landfills instead of being used to make energy.
Right.
And 4% of all of Europe's energy is a lot of energy. These are big plants, and China just built the biggest one in the world. With, I forget, it was 120 megawatts or something, quite a good size facility. And so that, they're against fire, but they're the cause of the big forest fires in the West. Like if you look at United States forests, the Southeast is where most of the timber harvesting is done these days. It used to be the West. There's still a lot there, of course, but that's almost all private land. There's almost never a catastrophic wildfire there because the land is managed. And if you think about before fossil fuels were invented, every year, the people who lived in camps on the prairies or towns or cities, the people would go out and gather all the dead wood in the forest all around them. And this would prevent these catastrophic wildfires from occurring. But as time has gone on, not only have forest managers that know what they're talking about lost control of the public lands, which is what most of the West is, or much of it. Most of the federal lands are in the West, and most of the federal politicians are in the East. So they can make decisions about the land in the West without having any repercussions on their own constituents. So this is one of the most dysfunctional.
It gets even worse, I think, like from the people I've talked to out here, obviously forest fighting was a huge industry out here for a while, and they had a very sophisticated, they had like a paratrooper system and everything. It was incredible.
Yep.
But from the people that I've talked to that work on the fires now, it's a bit sketchy in that those federal monies are only available when your fire reaches a certain level, essentially. And so I haven't gotten anybody to come on record and say this, but there's a lot of whispering about delaying, letting the fire reach a certain point so they can get that federal money, because it's a huge employer out here, quite honestly.
Well, the fire might not have been so bad in the first place if they had managed the forest properly, but there's no money being made from these forests anymore because it's off limits to harvesting. And so there's no money to manage it with. And what you end up with, I saw a situation in Oregon this last summer, just a little early in the summer last year, where there had been a 400,000 acre fire. It had killed in some places most of the trees, that in other places it had only killed a quarter or half the trees. They left all the dead trees standing so that the next fire is just going to burn the whole place down again. Because once those trees dry out, they become tinder. And so the situation in the management of forests in the private lands where people care about losing all their money to the federal lands in the West, that's the federal parks, the national forests, the BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land. It's a huge, Idaho is 70% federally owned of its whole land base. The federal government controls 70% of it. So they don't even have any say over what happens on those lands. That's a really important aspect of environmental protection in the countryside, and the countryside is huge in the United States and is not being managed well. People on farms are managing their farms well. They're not having huge wildfires. And the southeast of the United States, which is forests all the way from deep East Texas to Florida, all Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, all those states are and Mississippi has the highest forest land area in the whole United States of any state. And they're not having these big wildfires. And those are pine forests. I mean, they burn just as easy as the pine forests in California do. So, the Camp Fire, which killed over 80 people, they put those subdivisions right in a pine forest, right up to the road. And I wrote a little piece in my book about how you should look at Central Park if you want to see what a forest should look like in an urban environment. It should have virtually no coniferous trees in it because they're pitchy and they burn like a candle. Whereas oaks and willows and olive, birch, and all the broadleaf trees, they're not pitchy at all. You can't start a fire in those things. And so it's just so completely mismanaged that people don't even, and then of course the cause of the fire was PG&E built a power line and then didn't keep the trees clear of it. And a tree fell on the power line and started a fire, and all these subdivisions were burnt right to the ground. Interesting, the pictures of it, the houses were burnt right to the concrete. There's nothing left of them. The trees did better than the houses because there's still a lot of them alive.
What I think that the last thing that I wanted to say about the trees is just that this, to me, seems like another aspect of this back to nature fallacy, which is that the relationship between humans and their environment is to not touch the environment rather than to take care of the environment. And I see that as being an extension of the idea that humans are a blight and that the only way to live well is to erase the strange technological beast that we have become. And it makes a lot of sense to me because I feel like people live captured by a machine. They live under the constraints of politics and laws and industry and forces that are far beyond them. Like, we had this really weird experience the other day where we were in San Francisco and we're standing on a ridge above the ocean, and you can see as far as the eye can see that there's ships on the water. And the ships move not under the force of the people that are living on the land in a clear and directed way. It's just the system that operates in the background that all of us are suspended in. And I think that that's a really deeply alienating condition to exist in. And the environmental movement is that in a nutshell. I think that it's people trying to wrestle with their alienation from the systems in which they live and trying to scrabble back a little bit of the power that they believe that they once had. But I don't know that ever since the dawn of agriculture that they've really had that power, because the minute that you stop living in small tribes on the land and instead you are part of a system, right, where there are classes and there are technological duties that you must perform within that structure, you no longer have this ease of just being on the landscape. And it's solved a lot of things, right? It's removed the drudgery of survival, but it has not replaced it with something that is satisfying.
You said that very well. I like that. Where I feel the same way. I haven't used exactly those same words, but I think perhaps our social and mental or intellectual or capacities will not be capable of dealing with the internet age. It's already very clear that it's being used for really nefarious purposes by really nasty actors, and while I admire Elon Musk's character and his honesty, and it pains me that he would actually allow his people to write garbage just because it's his promotional position to do that. And okay, he's a salesman as well as being a brilliant technologist and etc. But and I'm not picking on him, except that he's easy pickings right now, because on one hand he's a hero, and on the other hand he's gaming the system. And so I'm afraid that we may not be able, as a cohesive civilization, to deal with this situation from an information bombardment point of view. And so I try to just stick to the science. And one thing that everybody should know is, and most of the mainstream media didn't even mention it. They told us when the coral reefs were dying. They told us when the Great Barrier Reef was 93% dead. And then they just shut up. And everybody thinks the coral reef is 93% dead. Last summer, the official coral reef people in Australia, the Coral Reef Management Plan or whatever it is, announced that last year the coral cover of the Great Barrier Reef was the highest it's been in the 38 years since they started measuring it. And that is the news. And yet, a very fine scientist, trying to remember his name now, but he was at the university, James Cook University in Queensland. He was fired for disagreeing with scientists who were saying the coral reef was dying, right up to their Supreme Court, their High Court. The High Court sided with the university in firing him, even though you're supposed to have freedom of speech in a university. That's the kind of thing that is happening these days around these issues. It's really hard to accept, just like it's hard to accept that golden rice hasn't been adopted by every tropical country in the world when 2 million kids are dying every year from not having it. And the level of disinformation is so high at this time. It is hard to soldier on some days, because everything I put out now is covered with banners saying misinformation, United Nations stuff, and it's just really frustrating. I mean, I've been working at this all my life, and I have a deep understanding of chemistry and biology and biotechnology and all of these things. And I know that people are being unfairly scared about so many of them. And it is the invisible and remoteness of things. Science is based on evidence, and evidence is observed through observation. You have to observe something before you can say it exists. But, God is invisible. The devil is invisible. All kinds of evil things are invisible. And chlorine is kind of invisible. CO2 is clearly invisible. So is radiation, and all of the remote things like polar bears and coral reefs and underwater stuff and stuff that's in the jungle. They keep saying that the Amazon is being destroyed. Hardly anybody lives in the Amazon. It's like it's called a human desert because it's not particularly hospitable. So it's hard to deal with that and to figure out how to get around it. So I write books, I do these interviews, I try to explain to people what the real situation is. But the Earth is not dying, and far from it. The CO2 fertilization effect is causing a massive increase, and you can go on the internet and look at NASA's satellite imagery of the Earth showing up to 30% increase in the growth of vegetation, especially in the driest areas, because CO2 not only fertilizes the plant, it also makes it more efficient with water, so that trees can now grow where trees couldn't grow before. Because when the CO2 goes up, the plant doesn't have to open its stomata so often or so wide, or have so many of them, that it doesn't lose as much water through. That's where the water gets out of the plant, transpiration. It also has a function. In order to pull the nutrients up from the roots, it has to leave some water into the air. But when the CO2 goes up, they're much more efficient in that process. So that's why forests are spreading out onto grasslands in many parts of the world now, not because there's more rain, but because they're using less water. And these are all very positive aspects of CO2, along with the fact that if it wasn't for CO2, there wouldn't be any life on the planet. And when you get down to, only hundreds of parts per million, the plants would like to have optimally at least 800. Now it's 425, at least 800, 1200 is even better. And the proof of this is every commercial greenhouse grower in the world injects CO2 into their greenhouse because they can contain it in there. And that makes the plants much more abundant and they grow faster and they grow bigger. And everybody knows that who's got a greenhouse, but nobody wants to tell anybody about it because it disproves the idea. And there's people working in those greenhouses all day and not having any suffering from it.
I mean, I think that it's a proxy for people being afraid that something bad is happening to their civilization, and your hopelessness about the information landscape and what the internet is doing to us, I think, is the seed of that hopelessness.
It's also it's also why we're all here today. Like, everybody who's listening, everybody's here because they're dissatisfied with the standard CNN narratives and they want to go deeper and talk to people who are outside of the chosen expert space. And that's actually, we're not alone. There's a number of podcasts that are popping up and other journalism forms, documentaries. There's people who are there's creators who are really just serving to bring people together around these issues. And I think there is a lot of hope there in that, of course, these major structures have gotten corrupted, but people are starting to kind of realize it too. And that's, I don't think we'd have a podcast if people weren't dissatisfied with the main information channels. And I think there's a lot of some of the most popular podcasts in the world are on that same tick.
And I think that the fight beyond the environmental fight is a fight for ideas. It's a fight for people to be able to think clearly in a landscape where there's a lot of noise. And I think that people inherently want to live alongside healthy ecosystems. They want to go to the beach and they want to see that there's fish and corals and seaweed and not garbage and this weird, greasy, slicked over water. Like when you go to the bay in San Francisco, it's terrifying.
They should come here. It's beautiful. There's
but
fish
they
everywhere.
Can't, right? So I think that the problem is that most people live in really degraded landscapes. They live in landscapes that have been...
Are you sure of that? Which kind of... like a farm, you mean?
No, I'm thinking about people, like even when... So, for example, if you live in the Bay and you live inside of the metropolis, like you live in San Francisco or Oakland,
well, that's a dense city.
Those are dense cities, and those dense cities give you the feeling that things are bad because they are. Like there's a lot of ills that haven't been addressed, and so people's fear about what they see playing out right in front of them is transmuted into a movement that tells them that they can do something simple to fix it. And so I think that whenever I talk about this, I really try to focus on the fact that people are experiencing a deep-seated dread about their lives because their kids go to school and they do these active shooter drills and life expectancy is decreasing and people are sick in weird ways and their environment is not lush. And they do all these studies where they show that, trees in a neighborhood help people feel good. And I think that it's because when you see a healthy tree, you feel like it's okay. When you see a healthy animal, you feel like it's all right, where you're not just alone. Because humans aren't meant to be alone the way that most of us live. Like, we live in dense urban environments for the most part. Even a city like the one that we live in, that's 30,000 people. It's dense enough that it's devoid of wildlife. And the wildlife that is here are like the deer that get smashed over and over again by cars. It's like it's not a harmonious existence. And I think that people place a lot of the blame on industry because of the algorithmic tendency of industry is to make money without much concern for how nice the environment is where they make that money.
There are so many beautiful places in this world. I know there's some slums and places where half the people are on drugs and living in the streets and pooping in the streets and all that stuff. I know that some cities have that problem. City that I lived in for many, many years, Vancouver, is the biggest city in British Columbia, just dismantled its tent city yesterday. And I don't think there's any way you can let that kind of deterioration happen at a social level. You have to help those people, but but giving them drugs every day for free isn't a very good way of helping them, as far as I'm concerned. So there's a lot of dysfunction, but by and large, though, I don't think the majority of people are unhappy. I guess maybe confused would be one way to put it. But the politics of the United States is one of polarization, whereas the politics of Canada is one-dimensional. We more or less don't have any opposition, and yet we have a prime minister who is a child, and is just he's a terribly bad person. He says he agrees with women's rights and the law, and then he fires the attorney general who's trying to deal with a crooked company so he can protect the company. He fires her, and she's a Native person as well. So we've got that kind of total disconnect going on in our leadership in Canada. And yeah, I mean, and then it comes to this whole trans issue and drag queens, and I mean, what's going on?
I mean, I think that
Drag
what's
queens
going
for
on is that
7-year-olds.
I think that what's going on is that there is a clear there's two clear poles. You have the left versus the right, and you can parameterize those however you want, but I think that the broadest sense is conservatism versus progressivism. And when you operate under the I think fairly reasonable perspective that the things that were done in the past were not the best way that they could be done. They were just done that way because it was what was cheapest, easiest, fastest, most productive. You have people that are looking around that are like, hey, how can we subvert all those tendencies? How can we change the default ways of how we do things? And that's a wave that lifts a lot of different movements and pushes them into the center. And so you have people questioning everything all at once, right? Because everybody recognizes that the information streams are one way or another corrupted. Most people are not able to realize that the information stream that agrees with them is also corrupted. And so there's just this mass of social foment that comes from dissatisfaction. It comes from dissatisfaction at looking out at the landscape and being like, our technology was supposed to free us. And instead what it does is it locks people inside the inner city where there's no grocery stores, or it keeps them at a desk job where they should be able to work 10 hours a week, but instead they're still expected to be there for 40. And so there's a deep frustration at what was promised, and that's the reaction that people are having, where they're like, these systems that were meant to develop our freedom and our embodiment in nature are denying us that.
Yeah, and that's very much the psychological aspect of it all. I agree. But then there's the physical aspect of it, which is how we manage to keep ourselves alive in these big cities where we do depend on the trucks to bring the food from the farms, which is also dependent on machinery. And we're not going back to 90% of the people working in stoop labor.
Yeah.
So if we're not careful at this juncture, the West, as it's called, will slip into decline, and the more authoritarian governments will continue to increase in power. I don't see any. That seems to me to be the big picture from a material point of view, uh, which I mean by which I mean things and energy. And
Well,
it's a very disappointing thing for me to see that we're going to lapse into some kind of absolute computer controlled situation where we really do lose our personal freedoms. And I think of my children. I'm not so worried about it for myself. I'm completely independent as it is, and always have been. I've never had a boss except my dad, and that's just a fact. I've been able to be independent my whole life, which is why I'm able to say a lot of the things I can say without being fired, because there's no one that can fire me.
I
And
wonder if these countries that are more authoritarian and that are still, not necessarily focused on decreasing burning or getting rid of combustion power sources, if they aren't on this, if there is something that is actually toxic in the byproducts of the Western industrial system, and there is no effort to remediate that toxicity by the time that these countries that have a greater fertility rate and have more authoritarian control start to actually use those technologies, then we'll see the same thing play out the world over again and again and again, where what you get to is you get a peak of industry, and then what that industry does is it kills all of the people, or not all of the people, obviously, because it's not an extinction crisis, but it degrades the biological stability of the people living inside of that system. And so unless you can figure out how to get past that in a way that you get to maintain the benefits, technological benefits of civilization without the harsh byproducts of it, then what'll happen is that the world will just keep running up into that limit in different places at different times. But that is always the technological ceiling, where you get to a point where you make enough that it's killing you in the process of making it. Only enough so that, God, there's this really interesting thing. We did an episode on population growth where ant colony populations are really interesting, where they get to this point where they start to run into resource limitation, and then they bifurcate, and half the ant colony goes somewhere else. The population declines of the mother ant colony until some level where it can start to grow again, and then it just continues oscillating like this. And
until I kill it with ant poison.
exactly, but it just feels like a cyclic thing that's going to happen on Earth until we can figure out these problems, because you want the technology, but you don't want the bad stuff to come with it. And the
Well, I
only
think we've
way
done a pretty good job of eliminating the bad stuff that comes with it myself. If you look at I mean, when I grew up in Vancouver, you couldn't see across the street in the fall because of the smoke and soot from burning. Everybody was burning sawdust to heat their homes.
Yeah, I mean,
And
that's the condition that we find ourselves. We live in a rural area, and come winter, you can feel it on your lungs. Everybody's
well,
burning
they
stuff.
do have catalytic converters for chimneys on wood stoves now, and some places they're required. In my town on Vancouver Island, you're not allowed to have a wood stove inside the city limits, so it's really very clean there. And so I don't think we have to worry as much about that. I mean, what we did in Greenpeace near the end of my time there was cleaned up all the rivers in Europe. They had not adopted the kind of pollution control laws that we have for air and water in North America, like we did in the early 70s with the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. And their rivers were basically dead. Rivers like the Rhine and the Elbe and the Thames were basically lifeless because the chemical industry was pouring stuff into them still in the 70s. And that's what we spent much of the 80s on. We bought a smaller boat called it the river boat, and went up those rivers and put frogmen in the water to plug the pipes of the factories that were putting the chemicals in underneath the water so no one could see it. But we researched where these were and what they were doing, and plugged the pipes and caused it to back up into the factory, and made news. So you got to make news.
But then there's the arc of that is that you have direct action, you have laws and then you see change, because those companies, as long as they're not breaking a law, are going to keep doing it. And I think
Yes.
that the worry that people have about, because we began this conversation and you made some pretty bold statements about, the harmlessness of the toxins that people are worried about. And I think that the concern is that if that's in the interest of industry to get people to believe that their waste products aren't toxic, because they would love to just be able to dump it in the river. They have to spend
No,
so much money.
they would not love to dump it
It's
into
so
the
much
river.
cheaper from just a bottom line perspective. Like, it
Yes,
would be
but
a lot,
that is not legal any longer.
but that's what I'm saying, is that they would love to be able to change the laws that allow them to do that.
I rather doubt that they would attempt to do that at this point in time.
Why?
Well, for one thing, it wouldn't work, because if something is toxic, you're not allowed to dump it into the water.
But toxicity is determined by EPA standards, and the EPA only tests a certain number of things. And
They
so,
test anything that anybody thinks is toxic.
right, but if you don't think, like, this is the DuPont thing, right? The DuPont makes Teflon. They have a C4 chemical that's super toxic, but they keep it in-house. Nobody ever knows that they have toxicity studies that show that it's really bad. They dump it in the Ohio River, and then later...
Who doesn't know that? You don't. How did you know it?
Well, because it's 50 years down the line. Like,
You mean 50 years ago?
50 years ago, right? Like, I'm sitting 50 years down the line from when they were dumping it, where this is all out in the open. But what I'm trying to say is that this stuff still happens. Like, those companies that are making new chemicals that aren't regulated yet.
I think you're a chemophobe, Anastasia.
I'm not.
Yes, you are, dear. You are.
But hold on.
You're way over the top on this. You'd be dead by now if everything you were saying was right.
I don't necessarily think that they're... So, okay. I have moved every 5 to 10 years for my whole life, from when I was a kid to now. And so I've never stayed for long enough in a single place to be contaminated by what's there. And I think a lot of people are in the same boat, where they move
There's a thing called cumulative contamination.
There is, but if it's different pathways, like, so chemicals will damage different pathways. And so
No. I just can't. I can't see your point here. You'd be dead if something was poisoning you.
But how soon would I be dead? Am I going to develop
as soon as it
cancer?
poisoned you.
Right, but
we do know people who have died really young,
I
too.
know a 26-year-old who worked on motorcycles who got colon cancer. Like, there's
But you're going to blame colon cancer on a motorcycle?
I mean, he was always exposing himself to large quantities of oil, wasn't wearing any PPE. Like,
Was he drinking it?
It was on his hands. I'm sure he was eating it. Like, he was putting it, like...
I worked in a shop when I was a kid. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just so thoroughly exaggerated. We are capable of dealing with living in a cave full of wood smoke for the whole day, all day, every day, especially the women. That's why smoking is why it's possible for us to survive smoking cigarettes, because we lived in an environment that was about as bad as smoking cigarettes for thousands of years.
Well, they didn't live that long, right?
Well, that wasn't the only reason they didn't live that long. There were plenty of them, but they didn't have. They had no antibiotics. They had no medicine.
But I think that what I'm trying to say is that
they had herbal medicine.
That's true. But what I'm trying to, like, the point that I really want to make here is not that the stuff that's in the water is toxic enough to kill you tomorrow. Like, you can drink a glass of it and you're fine. I'm talking about these long-term cumulative things that you get sick when you're 40 and 50. And that happens a lot. Like, you see people that are relatively young getting reproductive cancers, getting colon cancers, and we have treatments, and so we're able to fight that back. But
those people used to die young, but now a lot of them get to live to be quite a lot older.
Because we have technology, not because our environment is not causing it in the first place. Like, I'm a big believer in cancer as being an environmental sickness. Sure, there's some base rate of just DNA mutations with machinery and...
Well, there's some weird ones, right? Like, colon cancer is on the rise, especially in young populations, which is very disturbing.
Yeah, and so...
I think people want to be able to they want to be able to do something.
And I think that there is no clear indication to me that the stuff that the companies were doing 50 years ago has stopped. And it might be a different type of toxicity, but there's no reason, like, for example, you look at the CIA and they're doing all kinds of, government takeovers in third world countries during the 60s and 70s. And now we have this, I'm sure that this is going to get us banned off of YouTube, but now we have this almost naive perspective in the mainstream, which is that, well, they don't do that anymore. And I'm like, the hell they don't. You're just going to find out about it 50 or 60 years from now, because that's when the stuff's going to get declassified.
There's an element of that, I agree, but now it's coming out, the whole thing with the FBI and Twitter, and the other government agencies. This is why I think perhaps our culture can't survive this situation, because it's not. We thought that the internet was going to liberate us and make free speech easier, but it appears as though it's being used to control us in ways that we don't even know about. And I'm not all that optimistic about the future on that level. On the level, however, of chemistry and technology, I don't think we will ever be in a situation like industrial Europe was, when the whole place was smoke and the rivers were all dead, etc. That has been largely addressed through the years.
And I think, but I think that the addressing of it comes through laws, and we know that industry lobbies the government to repeal key laws that make it more expensive for them to operate.
Tell me one that's being repealed now.
Let me look it up. Hold on. I know the details of this, but I don't want to misspeak them. Oh, there was that huge court case. Hold on. There was a crazy court case where, there we go. So this happened last year. It said that the Supreme Court proposed that the EPA regulations are unconstitutional.
Yes, that's the Supreme Court.
But that's how, I mean, if the Supreme Court rules that laws are unconstitutional, then the industry can use that in order to lobby Congress to change the laws.
Well, that's because the law is unconstitutional.
But what
was the law? What was the law about?
It does not have the authority under Section 11D of the Clean Air Act to enforce proposed power plant emission limitations. And so they want to be able to take the catalytic converters that are scrubbing.
No, they don't want to do that.
Well, what do you mean? If they're trying to make the case that the EPA's regulations on emissions are unconstitutional,
what they're saying is that Congress has to authorize it. That's all they're saying there, is that the EPA is not the government.
Well, the Clean Air Act
is a bureaucracy.
Well, hold on. The Clean Air Act is a congressional act. So Congress...
Yes,
Congress,
but the Supreme Court ruled that the Congressional Act did not have that authority for them in it. That's all. I know that case very well.
But so if there's not a government agency that can enforce the tenets of the Act, who can enforce it?
It's not in the Act. That's why they can't enforce it.
No, it's Section 11D of the Clean Air Act that are proposed power plant emission limitations. And so if there's, look, you can make a law, but it's only you can make a law, but it's only
You're mischaracterizing the nature of that case. The nature of that case was the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had not given EPA the authority to do what they were doing, the specific thing they were doing at that time. Not that they couldn't regulate under the rules that they'd been given to regulate by the Congress in the Clean Air Act in the first place. The whole thing about CO2 is they're trying to say that it's a pollutant. That's what it finally comes down to. They're trying to say it's a pollutant when in fact it's plant food. It's not a pollutant. And in no way has it ever been proven to be a pollutant. So that's what that's all about. It's nothing to do with them wanting to putting smoke in the air again like they did before, or in the or dirty stuff in the water. But we have really good air and pollution control regulations in North America, as good as anywhere in the world.
But the only reason that those regulations work is because an industry, that a government agency like the EPA has the right to enforce those regulations.
It didn't have those regulations.
I'm not sure. What do you mean? It's in the Clean Air Act. It's Section 111D. I'm looking at it right now. Standards for performance for existing sources. And it's basically like the fact that power plants have to live up to established standards of performance for any existing air pollutants or for things that have not yet been classified.
I'll put it another way. This decision by the Supreme Court does not give the power plants the option of removing all their pollution control equipment and going back to 1946.
Not yet.
They never will.
Why?
Because no one would allow that to happen.
Well, who's the one who's in charge of allowing that to happen, if not the EPA?
Congress.
But the Congress isn't going to deal with each individual power plant. The Congress has vested its
They're going to
authority
deal with the entire issue.
Through the EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency is the agency that is deeded by Congress as being the federal government's hand for stopping power plants and other polluters from putting things into the air that they shouldn't be putting into the air. If the EPA is unconstitutional, into the
air are decided by the Congress, not by the EPA.
But the EPA is the enforcer of that, because the case was about the fact that the EPA was fining a company in West Virginia for putting things in the air that violated the act.
The Supreme Court made that decision? Because they wanted to help the company?
No, because is that beyond the scope of possibility?
More or less, yes.
Why?
Because it's very clear in the language. I'm a director of the CO2 Coalition, which is in Arlington, Virginia. Our whole job is to help people understand what CO2 is and what it isn't. This whole thing is about CO2. It's not about dirt or poison. It's about CO2. And that's why the Supreme Court has made that decision, because the EPA acted out of in a way. There was a previous Supreme Court decision on CO2. This is now challenging that previous position, and the Supreme Court decided that that previous position was wrong, and so it has reversed it basically. That and they're right about that. If anybody thinks that CO2 shouldn't be allowed to go into the atmosphere, I'm against them. Because it's the food for life, and it's really low, and it isn't hurting anything, and there's no proof that it's causing warming of the earth or anything else. Now they're saying it's causing floods, it's causing droughts, it's causing the hurricanes, it's causing snowstorms, it's causing heat waves. It's complete propaganda and absolute garbage. So I'm really happy that the Supreme Court recognizes that. Because it is a waste of time and money to regulate CO2. If CO2 went up to 5,000 parts per million, in other words, more than 10 times what it is now, it would not be a problem. Because it was at that level when there was an ice age once when CO2 was around 5,000-6,000 ppm.
I think that the point that I'm trying to make, though, goes beyond CO2. Because
no, it doesn't.
It does, because if there is a precedent set that industry can challenge the EPA's constitutional authority to enforce acts of Congress, then you have the ability of the industry that is producing a toxin or a pollutant, not CO2, to use that precedent in order to prevent their regulation by the federal government.
What did that industry lobby want to put in the environment that the EPA wasn't going to let them?
I'll look it up, but what I'm saying is
CO2.
that probably, right? Because this has to do with changes to the Clean Air Act in recent history. But what I'm saying is that the law operates on precedent. And if the precedent is that a new rule by
You're trying to tell the Supreme Court how to run its operation. The Supreme Court decided that they could not do what they were doing, the EPA. If the Congress wants to vote to let them, to make them not do what they are said to be doing, that's the Congress's business. That's how the government works. Those are the elected people. The EPA isn't elected; it's appointed by elected people. So it's no different than the FBI and all the other corrupt agencies in the U.S. government right now that are basically the permanent Washington government, as they call it. It's the deep state, and I'm against the deep state because I think it's corrupt. Never mind what party it's in or what side it's on. It's totally corrupt.
I mean, that's impossible to argue with, right? Deep state is definitely a huge problem.
Yeah, well, this was part of it.
Any definition of the deep state is basically the people who serve in government that survive changes administration.
They don't survive them. They're guaranteed to survive them.
So that's the Supreme Court.
No, the Supreme Court is elected.
The fact that the Supreme Court is elected does not change the fact that they don't change with administration.
It's for life.
What do you mean they're elected?
They're put into there's
appointed.
an election process.
They're appointed, yeah.
They're appointed, but they're different than an agency. They're not an agency. They're the Supreme Court.
But I mean, let's like abstract ourselves from the
I mean, I
the
see what he's
definitional
saying.
structure
Like
here.
they're regulating. Like, look, they're not interested. They're not talking about poisons. Is the thing, right?
No, what I'm saying is that somebody can use the precedent of this case
could,
to do the
but-
same
No, they
thing.
can't. No,
Why?
they
Well,
can't.
maybe they could, maybe they couldn't.
Why
But
not?
that will be
Because
dealt
it's
with.
they've already been given the authority to regulate those things.
Well, no, because this is the thing. They changed the Clean Air Act to include provisions about CO2, right? Because CO2 is classified as a pollutant that needs to be eradicated.
Yes,
Obviously,
and the Supreme Court has decided that that was wrong.
but check it out. The wording of the case doesn't have anything to do specifically with this being limited to just CO2.
That's what it's about.
I know, but that's the subtext, not the text. And so my point is that the law operates on subtext. If you have precedent that says that the EPA's standard for CO2 is unconstitutional and they don't have the right to enforce it, if there's a different chemical that the EPA says, hey, that's a poison, not like CO2, one that we, let's say, agree with, that's killing salmon or giving people cancer, then the same polluter can use the precedent of this case to undermine the constitutional authority of the EPA.
Well, for a while, like maybe they get away with that for a minute, but I think what he's saying is
That's totally incorrect.
people
Why?
would
It
people would be
doesn't
onto
give
that.
them that authority.
It gives them the authority to use it as precedent in order to have another
You
fight
can't.
with the EPA.
I don't know what you mean by use it as precedent. They're
Well, how
not
does
going
the
to.
law work? The law works by precedent.
Yeah,
the
but
ro-
that's no. It's the legal system that uses precedent, not the corporations.
Well, they do when they argue their ability to do something or not to do something,
Yes,
right?
but they have to argue it in front of the Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court has said that they're willing to undermine the constitutional right of the EPA to govern pollution.
Is that what they said? They're willing to undermine?
I mean, they have demonstrated that they're willing to undermine on the basis of
No,
not letting
that's
the
not
EPA.
what they've done. They have
I'm
not
not
what they've undermined is the fake CO2 story. That's what they've undermined. That CO2 is bad when CO2 is good. It's like banning water. If the Congress, if the EPA banned water, you'd go to the Congress and say, Congress, please rescind this order. And that's what they did here. Just like banning CO2 or banning water or banning food for that matter. They can't just ban anything they want. And in this case, they can't ban CO2 and they've got to go back to the drawing boards and at least prove that it's poisonous or something, or that it's destroying the world or whatever they think it's doing. But what it's really doing is making all our food grow faster and our atmosphere becoming more conducive to life. That's what it's doing.
What about this acidification business with the ocean? Because that was something that Daniel Pauly was really pointing at as the most important impact of the whole climate change narrative.
There's two big factors here. One is that when the oceans warm, they give off gas. They don't absorb it. So they're trying to say that half the CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere is going into the oceans. Well, half of it's going into increased growth on the land. They say the other half of what is not showing up every year is going into the oceans. I totally disagree with that. There's no evidence of it. There's no proof of it. So we don't even know if more CO2 is going into the oceans or not, because warming oceans would give off gas, not absorb it. That's the first point. The second point is there is no possibility in any chemical way that the oceans could ever become acidic. It's impossible. They are so alkaline that they cannot become acidic no matter what you put in them. It just don't happen. The oceans are 360 some times more able to withstand the effect of CO2 absorbing in them than freshwater is. As a matter of fact, fresh water is mostly acidic. There are clams and oysters that live in fresh water. Therefore, it is clear that in nature, shellfish can calcify in acidic conditions. There is no possibility that the oceans will ever become acidic because they act as though the effect of the lower pH by 0.1 from 8.2 to 8.1. They're saying that that's going to make it impossible for the shellfish in the sea to calcify. They are not calcifying in the sea. They are calcifying inside their bodies, where they can control the biochemistry completely. So no matter how acidic or less basic the ocean becomes, that won't affect the insides of these animals. They have their own biochemistry inside. It's been shown that the calcification can go down to pH 5 and even pH 4. So whereas the idea that CO2 could cause warming to the atmosphere has at least a shred of scientificness to it, in that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. But there's such a small amount of greenhouse gas compared to water vapor. And water vapor rules the situation anyways, because it's the clouds and it's the ice and it's the oceans and it's the rain. And like,
I saw this article this morning that the big Tonga eruption that happened last year put out, it added 5% water vapor to the atmosphere in a day.
yeah,
It was just like incredible. I don't think people realize it, but 80% of volcanic emissions are water. And water's, of course, a tremendous, I mean, it plays into all these narratives.
so the fact is that ocean acidification is purely incorrect. There's nothing right about it. It simply is not a factor. Whereas,
I would say in support of that, I was just looking, so bivalves and mollusks first evolved 500 million years ago. And as you were saying, the best proxies that we have suggest that carbon was at 2,000 ppm.
2,000 to 5,000 around in there. Yep.
And so it's if the argument is that increased CO2 levels would acidify the oceans to the degree that mollusks and bivalves couldn't survive, then their appearance in the record at 5,000 to 2,000 ppm CO2 seems to undermine that argument at the very least.
I have 2 peer-reviewed papers. I'm not a research scientist. I'm a ecologist at large. But the two peer-reviewed papers I did write, because I wanted these on paper, one is called The Positive Effects of Human CO2 Emissions on the Survival of Life on Earth. So it basically gives the argument that if we hadn't come along and started putting CO2 back in the atmosphere, life would have died within 1 million to 2 million years, which is a very short period of time. And the next one is called Ocean Acidification Revisited, with acidification in quotation marks. And tell me if you don't find it, if you'd like to read it, and I'll send it to you.
Definitely, we'll put them in the description. I mean, I'm not sure that I 100% agree with the premise that without the presence of humans that life on Earth would have died out, because I can see a pretty clear path to there being massive forest fires that put the CO2 back in the atmosphere once enough of the forests had died, releasing all of that for consumption elsewhere.
There would be little bumps along the way, but once all the forests had died, the CO2 would still be going down.
Wouldn't it be in the, why wouldn't it be in, I mean, so why was the CO2 going down? Do we know?
Yes, because of the shellfish, and the shellfish would continue to live much longer than the terrestrial life. The terrestrial life would die of oxygen, of CO2 depletion long before the marine life would, and then it would die itself out and all end up on the bottom.
So you think that the decrease from 5,000 ppm or 2,000 or whatever it was down to what we are at right now is solely due to shellfish?
No, it's fossil fuels are part of it. There are 100 million billion tons of carbon in carbonaceous rocks. There are approximately 10,000 billion tons in fossil fuels. So it's a very large factor. I mean, fossil fuels are not 1% of the carbon that has been captured by shellfish. And we,
Well, so
unfortunately, we
so
can't
where,
burn
so where
shellfish
does
for fuel.
So I guess that's the question of like, where does, and maybe this is a geologic question that is beyond the scope of the science at play here, but do you have an intuitive sense of why it was that the carbon dioxide levels consistently fell
Well,
before the appearance of
in
humans?
ups and downs, but basically they went down.
Yeah, so like why? Do you have any scientific perspective
The
on
shellfish.
that? So you think
There's
that,
no new CO2 being made hardly at all. All the CO2 came when the water came, when the earth cooled, came from the core. And whereas water's in all three states, gas, liquid, solid, CO2 is only in gaseous state, unless we make dry ice with it, which is something like minus 83 C. And so the CO2, once the shellfish dies, its shell falls to the bottom and turns into limestone. And then if there's pressure, it turns into marble. And then if it's the shells of coccolithophores, it turns into the White Cliffs of Dover. The entire White Cliffs of Dover are made with the shells of microscopic plankton, photosynthesizers called coccolithophores, which are one of the main bases of the food chain in the sea. And then the foraminifera eat the coccolithophores. They're an animal that is about the size of a tiny grain of sand. And much of the coral is from, much of the calcium carbonate comes from them. And then, of course, there's the larger shellfish, which make big shells and drop them on the bottom. But coral is about 50% of it. You know, if you think that the sea has risen 400 feet 40 times, and every time the coral has to grow up with it and then die when it falls again and grow up with it again and die, think of how much material is involved in. Coral reefs occupy a fairly large portion of the tropics.
yeah, and it looks like they also emerged right around 400 million years ago. So if it is all being like ocean sequestered, then that's interesting. I never thought about it that way.
Well, I think I'm the first one to have popularized this in the scientific community at my lecture at the Global Warming Policy Foundation in London in 2015 or 16. I'm a bit confused about it. I have to look it up again. But that lecture is available on the internet. And that was the first time that that I know that a public announcement of calcium carbonate being the primary cause of the decline in CO2 through the period of modern life, which began with multicellular life in the Cambrian explosion. That was the first time that was thrown out. And that was how many years ago now? 2015, 8 years ago. It's never been challenged. Never been challenged.
I like it from a mechanistic standpoint. I also think that it really allows you to put a different story on nature, right? Because if you have a type of body design that emerges and uses up all of the CO2, and then that has this cascading negative effect on other plants and animals, it recasts what humans are doing as being a natural tendency of all species, which is to use massively abundant resources at the expense of other species. And if what you're saying is correct, that had the trend continued, it would have caused its own mass extinction, then that allows us to look at the labor of humans in that same lens, which is that if we continue, we can cause great harms. It's not necessarily our fate to do so, the same way that it's not actually, if we weren't so able to look at cause, effect, and mechanism and value, then it would be our fate to do so, because we would just be like the mollusks, making more of ourselves and using what precious resources are left. But we have the ability to stand here and to look around and to be like, hey, we should be more careful than we were in the past because it's fragile, because our benefit comes at the expense of the other inhabitants of the planet. And the best set point is not one where there's just humans.
Well, of course not, but it's better than that. It's that we are the salvation of life. If we had not come along and inadvertently changed the carbon cycle from a negative to a positive one, life would end. And we might not even be here when the fruits of our labor continue on. Did you know that cement production produces about 10% of our CO2?
Mm.
So even cement is having a positive effect on the global ecology, as are fossil fuels. So that whole thing needs to be turned completely on its head. We are beneficial to the existence of life into the future. And we may last a long time because there's nothing even comes close to us. And the fact is species extinction began to decline after the extinction of the passenger pigeon. That was a big wake-up call, and people were starting to become civilized by the 1920s, and not just caring about themselves every day, but being able to look around in the world and see what was going on. And suddenly it became fashionable to want to protect species from becoming extinct. And there's not many species going extinct now, yet there's terrible propaganda around this subject. The United Nations people came to the Congress. They didn't know I was coming with my friend. And they said that the best estimate is that there are 8.7 million species. Actually, we only know of 1.7 million species that have actually been observed and named. Where are the other two? How many million is that? 6 more million species? Where are they? Because you know what they say next? That within the next 50 years, at least 1 million species will go extinct. Well, 3 million species go extinct while you were sleeping and you wouldn't know it had happened because you didn't know they were there in the first place. That's the kind of BS these people are pushing. And these are supposed to be top scientists, 3 of them. And you know what the Committee on Water and Air did after that hearing where my friend, I'm not so good at remembering names right now, but anyways, my good long-term friend, environmental guy, and me have worked together a long time, and we went before that Congress without them knowing we were coming. And of course, it was a Democratic Congress under who was there before Biden? No, this wasn't after Clinton came in. Clinton.
Obama?
Right? Obama. Yeah, it was during Obama's 2 terms. And sorry, I'm Canadian. Sometimes I don't remember everything. We went before them and gave them the full skinny and said, what are these guys talking about? There's not 8 point some million species. There's 1.7 million. And so therefore, if 2 million died, you wouldn't know what had happened. And what kind of science is that? And you know what they did? They did not keep that transcript. They had another meeting in a different committee with those same people without us. And that's what made the transcript for the meeting. It was only those guys getting to talk.
And that's what it all comes down to, it seems like, is there's more of a metaphysical battle here than a physical. The threat is not from outside of humanity. It seems to be from within our own information channels.
Yep.
And that's something that I really hope everybody who's listening will come forth with their ideas. And I really want to see the comment section on this video, because this is the final frontier, as far as I'm concerned, is how we get a grip on the humanity of these huge systems once again, because there's no doubt that they've been corrupted in many cases beyond utility or in the face of their own original utility. And how we solve that problem is ultimately going to decide whether the civilization makes it or doesn't.
Well, I hate to say so, Shiloh, but I'm not putting money on that.
I am, because I got at least 40 more years to live out here. So, you know what I mean? I would really want to see it work out. And honestly, there's a lot of things I love about our civilization. So,
yep,
I want to see and like you said, I don't think anybody's really talked about this. We haven't talked about it on the show, but it really felt like the thing was gonna come apart for a second a couple years ago. There was a moment where we were storing up rice and there was a moment, and people haven't really decompressed on that yet, but it at least here in America, it felt very unstable for a second, and I really don't want to see that happen. I'm sure the Earth will be fine.
No,
yeah, well,
it's just the Earth will be fine. It's the human civilization that's not going to do so well.
That's what I think we're all circling around here.
If they pull off this net zero thing in any big way, we're just going to go down a drain hole. There could be massive starvation, especially if they go after fertilizer, which is also made from natural gas. That's the Haber-Bosch process that won 2 Nobel Prizes in the early 1900s for figuring out how to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and combine it with natural gas to make ammonia. And that makes nitrogen fertilizer. And what people don't realize is that plants are not able to fix nitrogen by themselves. They need the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil to do that for them. And many plants are called nitrogen fixers because they actually house these bacteria in their roots. It's a relationship, that kind of relationship that everybody likes.
Mutualistic.
Yeah, symbiosis, yes. Where the bacteria gives nitrogen to the plant and the plant sends sugar down to its roots. Well, they do that anyway to grow their roots, but they let the bacteria have some of the sugar. And so it's just a perfect relationship. And in where I am here in Baja, it's called a dry tropical forest. And the soils are very poor here. It's very sandy, rocky soils. That's why really a large percentage of the plants here, especially the trees, are nitrogen fixers. And all of the legumes, which they changed to Fabaceae, so no one would know what they were talking about. But the legumes, peas and beans and such, are all nitrogen fixers. Alfalfa, for example. That's why they rotate it to put more nitrogen back in the soil between crops that don't have, like corn isn't a nitrogen fixer, I don't think. So anyways, hey, it's really been good talking to you too, Anastasia. And I said your name right a minute ago.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Shiloh. Yeah, I love that name. Do you have a horse?
I used to. No, I used to actually ride a lot of horses. Honest to God.
No, it's a good Western name.
Yeah, it's American.
Yeah, very much so. We don't have Shilohs up here.
Maybe in the
well,
future.
down here. I'm down here now, but when I'm up there, I've never met a Shiloh before. Nice to meet you. And I don't think I've met an Anastasia, but I certainly know the name. Well, I know both names, so it's nice to meet you both.
Yeah, good to meet you. Thank you for coming by.
I'm worn out, so I'm going to sign off. And
Fair enough.
Thank you very much for a lengthy interview. And one day I'll tell you why polar bears would not exist if it wasn't for climate change. It's because
is it because the poles got warmer?
No, it's because they got colder. The polar bear evolved from the Eurasian brown bear, which is what we call grizzly bear. And that as the warmer world got warmer, the ice came down further and further and further each year until it met the north shore of Russia and Europe. And some brown bears went on the ice to hunt for seals and eventually turned into polar bears. It took about 500,000 years. And even today, though, polar bears and brown bears can breed successfully and produce viable offspring, which is actually the definition of a species. So according to one definition of species, at least, they are still the same species. But because they're so differentiated, they're given separate Latin names.
Yeah, that word species is a huge problem. We've run up against that a million times. It's pretty dubious.
There's no actual... because species evolve from each other and out of each other, there's no actual day when they become different species. The barred owl and the spotted owl in the United States are a really good example. During the major glaciations, the Rocky Mountains became a barrier to that species interbreeding. And so the eastern barred owl and the western spotted owl are in fact the same species and can still interbreed. And they're thinking of killing all the barred owls that come so that they can protect the spotted owls.
Oh my God. We'll open that can of worms next time.
Leads people into some pretty goofy policy suggestions. So
I really
thanks a million.
appreciate you coming by. It's really, I think that it's rare to find people that have devoted so much of their lives to the pursuit of knowledge and clarity of thought, and I know that it must have been a hard road for you, and so I appreciate that you're still fighting it.
Had a lot of fun along the way too.
That's good.
Take care.
All right.
Well,
See you later.
Hope to see you again.